In the summer of 1944, the forests of Belarus seemed to whisper with secrets. Deep among the marshes and rolling fields, whole armies stirred in silence, hidden beneath camouflage nets and the dense green canopy of pine and birch. The peasants who still worked the land, stooped in exhaustion from years of German occupation, heard the rumble of trucks and the clatter of tank treads somewhere beyond the tree line, but they did not dare ask questions. They simply kept their heads low, knowing that something vast and terrible was about to begin. The war in the East, already the most destructive conflict the world had ever seen, was preparing for yet another storm. The Soviet Union had endured nearly 3 years of agony since the day Hitler's armies had swept across its borders in June of 1941. Whole cities had been burned, millions had been killed or taken into captivity, and swathes of land from the Baltic to the Black Sea had fallen under the iron heel of the Wehrmacht. Yet the tide had turned. Stalingrad had been held, Kursk had seen the German panzers smashed, and now, in 1944, the Red Army was no longer the battered force of desperate conscripts it had once been. It was a hardened juggernaut, rebuilt, reorganized, and thirsting for vengeance. The German Army Group Center, stretched across Belarus, was the great anchor of Hitler's Eastern Front. To its north lay Army Group North, clinging to the Baltic states. To its south, Army Group North, Ukraine shielded the approaches to Poland. But in the middle, in the dense swamps and rolling plains of Belarus, Army Group Center held a long and vulnerable line. It was commanded by Field Marshal Ernst Busch, a man loyal to Hitler's orders, but it was weak, under strength, and stretched thin. Years of attrition had drained its divisions. Supplies were scarce, tanks and fuel scarcer still. Yet Hitler had declared that the front must be held at all costs. Retreat was forbidden. Every fortress city was to be defended to the last man. What the Germans did not know was that in the spring of 1944, the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, had chosen this sector for their greatest offensive yet. Joseph Stalin wanted nothing less than the complete destruction of Army Group Center. His generals, Zhukov, Vasilevsky, Rokossovsky, Chernyakhovsky, and Bagramyan, understood that such a blow would rip open the German Eastern Front. If Army Group Center collapsed, the road to Poland would be open. The liberation of Belarus would be achieved, and the myth of German invincibility would be shattered beyond repair. The code name was chosen carefully: Operation Bagration. It was named for Pyotr Bagration, the heroic Russian general of the Napoleonic Wars who had resisted the French invasion of 1812 and whose men had bled at Borodino. The symbolism was unmistakable. Just as Napoleon's Grande Armée had perished on these very fields, so too would Hitler's armies. Throughout May and early June, the Soviets prepared with meticulous detail. Entire fronts, numbering millions of men, were shifted into position under a veil of deception. Camouflage nets covered artillery batteries that stretched for miles. Decoy airfields were built to mislead German reconnaissance. Radio traffic was manipulated to convince the enemy that the next Soviet blow would fall in Ukraine or even the Baltic. The art of maskirovka, the Soviet science of deception, was practiced to perfection. German aerial reconnaissance flights reported little of significance. Their intelligence officers, relying on faulty assumptions, concluded that the Soviets would once again strike south. All the while, the reality grew in silence. In the forests of Belarus, more than 2.5 million Soviet soldiers gathered, over 5,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, 30,000 artillery pieces, and hundreds of Katyusha rocket batteries waited in secrecy. Over the skies, the Red Air Force massed thousands of aircraft, their wings prepared to blot out the sun when the hour came. It was one of the greatest concentrations of military power ever assembled. The German soldiers along the front sensed something was wrong. They were veterans, many of them, men who had survived Stalingrad, Kursk, and countless battles across the steppe. They noticed the strange quiet at night. The odd way the Soviet patrols seemed bolder, the occasional prisoner who hinted at vast forces being gathered. They reported their fears to their officers, but the higher command dismissed it. Hitler himself had declared that the front must be held. He believed the Soviets could not strike with such force in Belarus, with its forests and marshes. It was, in his mind, unsuitable for tanks, unsuitable for great offensives. He could not have been more wrong. As the days lengthened toward the summer solstice, Soviet soldiers wrote final letters home. Some hurried and hopeful, others grim and resigned. They sharpened bayonets, cleaned rifles, and whispered in their dugouts about the great offensive to come. Many were peasants from villages that had been burned by the Germans, men who had lost families to executions or deportations. For them, this was not just a war of nations, it was personal. Every step westward was vengeance, every bullet a measure of justice. Civilians, too, felt the tension. In occupied villages, the Germans dug trenches, strung barbed wire, and forced peasants to work on fortifications. Rumors spread in hushed voices. The Red Army was coming. Some dared to hope, others feared reprisals. Collaborators whispered nervously. Resistance fighters sharpened knives and checked pistols hidden under floorboards, ready to rise when the moment came. The forests of Belarus were alive with partisans, tens of thousands of them, who had waged a shadow war for years. They blew up rail lines, ambushed convoys, and guided Soviet forces through the labyrinth of swamps and rivers. In the weeks before the offensive, their activity intensified, severing communications, crippling supply routes, and blinding the German army. And then came the 19th of June 1944. Across the front, Soviet artillery began to rumble. It was not yet the full barrage, not the apocalyptic firestorm that would signal the offensive itself, but probing bombardments, raids, and reconnaissance in force. German positions were tested, their responses measured. To the south, in Ukraine, heavy Soviet movements were staged deliberately to keep the Germans guessing. Field Marshal Bush pleaded for reinforcements, but Hitler refused. The divisions that might have been spared were already committed to Normandy, where Allied forces had landed on June 6. The Reich was being pulled apart on two fronts, and nowhere would the strain prove deadlier than in Belarus. The nights grew shorter. The forests hung heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. Soldiers on both sides lay awake in their foxholes, listening to the distant growl of artillery, the drone of engines, the clank of armor moving into position. The Germans sensed that something vast was coming, but they had no idea of its scale. On the evening of June 21, Soviet commanders received their final orders. Messages crackled over field radios. Sealed envelopes were opened in command tents. Maps were unfurled, fingers traced across rivers and highways, arrows drawn in thick red pencil. Commissars gathered troops and spoke of vengeance, of liberation, of duty to the motherland. Some soldiers cheered, others sat in silence, lost in thought. The weight of history pressed upon them. In the early hours of June 22, exactly 3 years to the day since the Germans had launched Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet guns began to speak. At first, it was a low rumble, like distant thunder. Then, within moments, it became a deafening roar, a storm of steel that shook the very earth. Thousands of artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. The night sky was torn apart by flashes of orange and white. Trees splintered, trenches collapsed, and German soldiers were hurled into the air by the force of the explosions. The howling of Katyusha rockets followed, a sound so terrifying that German veterans called it Stalin's organ, a chorus of shrieking death that shredded nerves before the shells even landed. For hours the bombardment continued, unrelenting, unmerciful. Villages along the front vanished in pillars of smoke. Bunkers collapsed, wire entanglements were blasted apart, and entire regiments were buried where they stood. German radios crackled with desperate calls for help, but few replies came. Command posts were hit, communications severed, lines of command broken before the infantry had even advanced. And then, as the sun rose over the forests and marshes of Belarus, the Red Army moved forward. Millions of boots tramped across fields, blackened with smoke. Tanks rumbled over shattered defenses, their turrets swiveling, guns blazing. Infantry surged behind rolling barrages, bayonets fixed, faces grim with determination. Engineers cleared minefields under fire, dragging logs to fill anti-tank ditches. Cavalry patrols slipped through forests. Partisans guided columns along hidden trails. The offensive had begun. For the Germans, it was as if the earth itself had risen against them. Entire divisions were caught unprepared, their positions obliterated, their reserves too weak to respond. Soldiers stumbled from burning trenches, dazed, ears ringing, only to be cut down by advancing Soviet infantry. Officers tried to rally their men, waving pistols, shouting orders. But the tide was unstoppable. The storm that had gathered in silence for months had broken at last. Operation Bagration had begun, and with it came the destruction of Hitler's proudest army group. The guns that roared across Belarus on the 22nd of June 1944 did not come out of nowhere. They were the result of months of planning, months of carefully laid traps, illusions, and movements designed to mislead, confuse, and blind the German high command. The Soviet Union had learned, through bitter trial and error, that victory did not come from sheer numbers alone. It came from precision, coordination, and above all else, deception. The Red Army called it maskirovka, a word that meant disguise, concealment, misdirection. In Operation Bagration, maskirovka became an art form, one of the most brilliant feats of military trickery in history. The Germans had long considered themselves masters of strategy, inheritors of the traditions of Clausewitz and Moltke, practitioners of the bold maneuvers that had humbled Europe. But by 1944, their arrogance had hardened into blindness. Hitler himself believed he could predict Soviet moves better than his own generals. He was certain that the next Soviet offensive would strike in Ukraine or in the Baltic states, where the geography seemed more favorable to tanks. Belarus, with its marshes, swamps, and thick forests, seemed unsuitable for a major offensive. To the Führer, it was a quiet sector, and the Soviets were determined to make him believe that. The groundwork for the deception began at the Tehran Conference in late 1943, when Stalin promised Roosevelt and Churchill that the Red Army would launch a massive summer offensive to coincide with the Allied landings in France. Stalin had long pressed for a second front, and now he saw the chance to coordinate in a way that would bleed the Germans dry. He chose Belarus as the strike zone, but the Germans could never know that. If they concentrated reserves there, the operation might stall. The key was to convince them the main blow would fall somewhere else. Soviet intelligence orchestrated a symphony of lies. Radio operators set up in Ukraine transmitted a constant stream of fake chatter, suggesting that preparations for a great offensive were underway in that sector. False troop movements were staged in the open, with wooden tanks and dummy artillery carefully arranged where German aerial reconnaissance would see them. Trucks dragged logs along dirt roads to raise dust clouds, mimicking the movement of entire armored divisions. At night, decoy fires flickered along fake bivouacs, while real troop concentrations remained hidden deep in forests, camouflaged beneath nets and branches so carefully woven that from the sky, nothing but a green blur could be seen. Partisans played their part too. In Belarus, where the real attack would come, they intensified their raids. Rail lines were cut, bridges blown up, German columns ambushed in forests. But in Ukraine, too, false activity was staged to draw German eyes southward. German intelligence officers, overwhelmed by conflicting reports, chose to believe what they wanted to believe, that the Soviets would again try to break into Romania with its vital oil fields, or into the Baltic states, to cut off Army Group North. Very few suspected that the true storm would come in Belarus. On the German side, there were warnings. Aerial reconnaissance noted unusual Soviet movements in the forests near Vitebsk, Orsha, and Mogilev. Prisoners spoke of great armies gathering for an attack. Officers at the front reported suspicious quiet in some sectors, unusual artillery movements in others, but their reports traveled upward into a chain of command where Hitler's voice was supreme. He dismissed such warnings. The Soviets, he believed, were incapable of launching such a massive offensive in the swamps of Belarus. His own generals, cautious of contradicting him, reinforced his illusions. And so the trap was set. Meanwhile, inside the Red Army, planning was meticulous. Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, two of Stalin's most trusted marshals, supervised the preparations. They divided the massive front into several thrusts, assigning them to different fronts. Rokossovsky's first Belarusian front would attack from the south. Chernyakovsky's third Belarusian front would strike from the north. Bagramyan's first Baltic front would push westward to cut off German reinforcements. And in the center, the second Belarusian front would crush the Germans in Mogilev. 4 great hammers would fall at once, with Army Group Center caught squarely in the middle. Secrecy was absolute. Soldiers moved at night. Artillery was wheeled into position under the cover of darkness, concealed by camouflage nets by day. Engineers dug entire networks of trenches and gun pits, carefully disguising their work with foliage. Supply dumps, stacked with shells and fuel, were hidden in barns, forests, even underground. Airfields were constructed in secret, concealed until the moment came. Entire divisions moved into position without the Germans ever suspecting their true strength. The deception extended even to the soldiers themselves. Many units knew only that they were moving west, not the exact place or time of the coming offensive. Orders were sealed and delivered at the last possible moment. Commanders briefed their men with fiery speeches, but details were often withheld until hours before the attack. The secrecy was suffocating, but it worked. German intelligence remained blind, unaware that over 2 million men were massed against them. Inside the German headquarters, confidence still reigned. Reports of Soviet buildup were dismissed as exaggerations. The idea that Army Group Center, the proud formation that had once spearheaded Barbarossa, could be annihilated in a single campaign was unthinkable. Their divisions might be under strength, their tanks few, their Luftwaffe depleted, but the Germans trusted in their discipline, their fortifications, and their Führer's orders. They had survived winter battles before. They had beaten back offensives before. Surely, they thought, they could do so again. But Maskirovka ensured that when the storm broke, it would break with total surprise. On June 20, just 2 days before the offensive, Soviet reconnaissance units slipped into no man's land. Crawling through mud, hidden by night, they cut gaps in the German wire and marked paths for the infantry to follow. German patrols stumbled upon some, firefights flaring briefly in the darkness, but most made it back unreported. Behind them, Soviet artillery batteries were already loaded and ready. Their barrels were elevated, coordinates set, shells stacked in neat rows like cordwood. In command posts, phones buzzed, maps were spread, and generals waited for the clock to strike. The soldiers who would carry the weight of the attack prepared in silence. In foxholes and tents, they tightened straps, loaded magazines, and whispered to one another. Some thought of home, of wives or mothers or children. Others sharpened bayonets and promised themselves vengeance. Commissars strode among them, delivering final words of encouragement. "Comrades," they said, "before us lies the land of our fathers, our mothers, our children. Before us lies liberation. The fascists have bled our land for 3 years. Now we will bring them fire. Now we will bring them death. The hour has come." The deception had worked so well that even in the last hours before the offensive, German soldiers reported little unusual. Some heard distant rumbling, but assumed it was routine. Others saw Soviet patrols, but thought them probing attacks. The officers reassured them that reinforcements stood ready, that their fortresses would hold. They had no idea that what faced them was the greatest concentration of force the Soviets had ever assembled. When the guns opened at dawn on June 22, the Germans were stunned not just by the violence but by the scale. Entire sectors erupted in fire at once. The deception had kept them blind until the last possible moment, and by then it was too late. The Soviet mastery of Maskirovka meant that Bagration began not as a battle, but as an ambush on the grandest scale imaginable. An army group of 400,000 men found itself suddenly under assault by over 2 million. Communications collapsed. Command posts vanished in firestorms, and entire units were swallowed in the first hours. The Wehrmacht had prided itself on maneuver, on seizing the initiative. But here there was no initiative to seize. They had been caught in a trap woven from lies, silence, and shadows. As the offensive swept forward, German officers realized too late the genius of their enemy. For years, they had dismissed the Soviets as clumsy, reliant on brute force and numbers. But Bagration revealed the truth. The Red Army had grown into a machine of war not only capable of matching German tactics, but of surpassing them. Their deception was flawless, their coordination impeccable, their timing perfect. What began in silence, with decoys and false signals, had erupted into a cataclysm that no German could withstand. And so, even as the earth shook with shells and the skies screamed with Katyusha rockets, a different kind of victory had already been won, the victory of the mind, the victory of illusion. Operation Bagration was more than a military assault. It was a masterpiece of deception, the storm made invisible until the moment it broke. The dawn of the 22nd of June, 1944, broke heavy and gray over the forests and marshes of Belarus. For the men of Army Group Center, it was another morning in what they thought was a quiet sector. Birds stirred in the thickets, mist clung to the meadows, and in the trenches along the front, German sentries rubbed sleep from their eyes and checked their rifles. It was the 3rd anniversary of Barbarossa, the day the Wehrmacht had hurled itself eastward in a storm of fire. Few of them remembered it without a shiver. They had been the hunters then, advancing like wolves into Soviet lands. Now, they were the prey, though they did not yet know it. At 5:00 inches the morning, silence broke. The earth itself seemed to groan, as if some vast leviathan had stirred in the soil beneath. Then the horizon flared orange. The first Soviet shells screamed through the air, their trails carving arcs across the dawn. A heartbeat later, the world exploded. Artillery thundered from thousands of guns hidden in the forests. Mortars, howitzers, heavy field pieces, all opened fire at once in a barrage so overwhelming that German soldiers thought the very sky had been torn apart. Trenches vanished under geysers of earth. Bunkers crumbled as shells detonated above and within them. Trees shattered like matchsticks, their trunks splintered, their leaves catching fire. The ground quivered and shook, dust and smoke rolling over everything. And then came the sound that froze men's blood, the howling scream of Katyusha rockets. The multiple rocket launchers, mounted on trucks and hidden in the woods, unleashed salvo after salvo, their fiery trails streaking across the heavens like the tails of comets. The scream was shrill, inhuman, as though the air itself had been ripped apart, followed by explosions that tore entire positions to shreds. German soldiers, who had never faced them before, clutched their helmets and prayed, their ears ringing, their hearts pounding with terror. Even veterans of Stalingrad and Kursk flinched at the sound. It was unlike anything else, a chorus of mechanical demons announcing the storm. In the command posts, chaos reigned. Communications lines were shredded by the first shells. Radio signals were jammed or drowned out by static. Officers barked orders that went unheard, their voices lost in the roar of the barrage. Entire companies disappeared in an instant, their trenches obliterated, their men buried alive. Survivors staggered out of the smoke, coughing, bleeding, their uniforms torn, their rifles gone. Above, Soviet aircraft filled the skies. Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack planes swooped low, their cannons and rockets raking roads, bunkers, and supply columns. Bombers droned overhead, their payloads falling in clusters, turning crossroads and bridges into craters. German fighters scrambled to meet them. But the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Outnumbered, outgunned, They were swarmed by Soviet Yak and La-5 fighters. One by one, the black crosses fell from the sky, their wreckage burning in forests and fields. For the men on the ground, there was no comfort from above. The skies belonged to the Red Air Force. The barrage did not last minutes, it lasted hours. For 3 solid hours, the guns thundered, the rockets howled, the bombs fell. German soldiers pressed themselves into the dirt, ears bleeding, nerves snapping. Some wept, others screamed, others sat stunned, their minds gone blank under the ceaseless roar. A few tried to fight back, manning machine guns or mortars, only to be silenced by another explosion moments later. When the guns finally lifted, silence did not come. Instead, came the sound of whistles, shouts, and the steady, rhythmic pounding of boots. Through the smoke, through the dust, through the shattered trees and ruins, the Red Army advanced. Waves of infantry surged forward, rifles at the ready, bayonets fixed. Some wore steel helmets, others soft caps, their uniforms dark with sweat and grime. Commissars waved flags, urging them on. Tank brigades followed, their treads crushing wire, logs, and corpses alike. T-34 seconds rolled forward in endless lines, their cannons firing into bunkers, their machine guns sweeping trenches. Behind them, engineers cleared mines and obstacles, dragging logs to fill anti-tank ditches, detonating charges to collapse wire fences. The German soldiers who survived the barrage rose to meet them in shock and disbelief. MG-42 machine guns rattled, spitting bullets in desperate arcs. Mortars thumped, sending shells into advancing ranks. Anti-tank crews wheeled their guns into position, firing at the Soviet armor with practiced speed. A few T-34 seconds burst into flames, their crews spilling out, burning alive. Soviet soldiers fell in rows, their bodies crumpling in the mud, but for every man who fell, another took his place. The waves did not stop. The Soviet artillery shifted its fire deeper, pounding crossroads, command posts, and reserves. The Germans had nowhere to run. Reinforcements trying to reach the front were caught in ambushes, their columns shredded by airstrikes and partisan sabotage. Roads were clogged with wreckage, burning trucks, overturned wagons, dead horses. Officers tried to rally their men, shouting, waving pistols, dragging them back into line. But the shock of the opening barrage lingered. Nerves were frayed, discipline shaken. Some fought with grim determination, others simply broke, throwing down their weapons, stumbling rearward with blank eyes. In the forests around Vitebsk, the 3rd Panzer Army felt the full weight of the northern hammer. Its defenses, already weakened, crumbled under the barrage. Entire divisions were engulfed. At Orsha, the 3rd Belarusian Front smashed into the Panzer Grenadiers, holding the Moscow-Minsk highway. In Mogilev, the 2nd Belarusian Front surged forward, cutting into the flanks of the 4th Army. To the south, Rokossovsky's 1st Belarusian Front thundered through swamp and forest, where German commanders thought no army could possibly advance. Everywhere the hammers fell, and everywhere the line began to buckle. For the Soviets, the sight was intoxicating. Men who had endured the terror of 1941, who had seen their comrades slaughtered and their homes destroyed, now pressed forward with fire in their veins. "For Moscow!" they shouted. "For Stalingrad! For the motherland!" Commissars waved red banners, their cloth tattered and stained, urging the soldiers onward. The smell of cordite, smoke, and burning flesh filled the air, but the momentum was unstoppable. In one sector, German defenders watched as Soviet infantry advanced across a field littered with craters. They opened fire, mowing down scores. Yet the Soviets did not stop. They advanced through the smoke, bayonets gleaming, shouting as they charged. The Germans fired again, and again men fell. But when the Soviets reached the trenches, there was no hesitation. Grenades flew, bayonets plunged, and the trenches were overrun in moments. Survivors were dragged from dugouts, their eyes wide with shock. Some resisted, others raised their hands, surrendering to a tide that seemed endless. What the Germans did not know What they could not know was that this was only the beginning. The opening barrage had shattered their front line, but the Soviets had layers upon layers of reserves waiting behind. For every division that attacked, another waited to exploit the breakthrough. For every tank that fell burning, another was already rolling forward. For 3 years the Soviets had endured, rebuilt, trained, and now the fruits of that labor were unleashed in a torrent of steel and blood. By the end of the first day, the scale of the disaster began to dawn on German commanders. Divisions were reporting losses of half their strength. Trenches were gone, bunkers destroyed, artillery silenced. Communications with forward units were patchy or gone entirely. The Luftwaffe reported near total inability to contest the skies. What little intelligence they could gather was grim. The Soviets were advancing everywhere, with overwhelming force, and there seemed no way to stop them. In the rear, Hitler fumed. Reports reached him of the massive assault, but he refused to believe that Army Group Center was in mortal danger. "Hold your ground," he ordered. "Not one step back. Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Bobruisk fortresses to be defended to the last man." To him, these were symbols, linchpins of the line that must not fall. To the men on the ground, they were death traps. Orders to hold meant encirclement. Orders to stand meant annihilation. But there was no arguing with Berlin. The opening barrage had already sealed their fate. The Soviets were inside their defenses, and the flood could not be turned back. As darkness fell, on June 22, the fires still burned. Villages smoldered, their wooden houses reduced to ash. Fields were littered with bodies, German and Soviet alike. Horses lay dead in their harnesses, wagons overturned, tanks burning like torches in the night. The sky glowed orange from the flames, and the smell of death hung heavy in the humid summer air. Soldiers on both sides lay exhausted in trenches and craters, some too tired to eat or speak. Others sat silently, staring into the distance, their faces blank with shock. For the Soviets, exhaustion was mixed with triumph. They had survived the opening clash. They had broken the German front in a single day. For the Germans, disbelief mingled with despair. The front that had once marched to Moscow was now collapsing, its soldiers scattered, its commanders powerless. The barrage of June 22 was more than the beginning of an offensive. It was the sound of a reckoning, the thunderclap that marked the collapse of the old balance on the Eastern Front. From that moment forward, the Germans were not the hunters. They were the hunted, running before a storm they could not stop. And the storm was only just beginning. The smoke of the opening barrage still clung to the forests when the Red Army's hammer fell upon Vitebsk. For months, the city had been marked on Hitler's maps as a linchpin, a bastion that must never be surrendered. Its position at the junction of the Dwina River and the surrounding roads made it a natural fortress, a gateway that controlled the northern flank of Army Group Center. Hitler had decreed it a Festung, a fortress city, to be held to the last man. For the soldiers stationed there, that decree was less a badge of honor than a sentence of death. Vitebsk itself was no metropolis. It was a city scarred already by 3 years of occupation, its wooden houses weathered, its cobbled streets rutted with carts and boots. The churches that dotted its skyline bore the marks of artillery fire from earlier battles, their domes cracked, their walls chipped. Yet its ruins were crowded with German troops, men of the 53rd Corps, including divisions that had once been strong and proud but were now shadows of themselves. They were tasked with holding the city against whatever the Soviets could throw at them. None suspected that whatever the Soviets could throw would soon mean the concentrated might of entire fronts. On June 23, as the dust of the opening barrage still drifted, the Third Belarusian Front surged forward. General Ivan Chernyakhovsky, the youngest of Stalin's front commanders, directed the assault with precision. Artillery rolled closer to the front lines, pounding roads and strongpoints. Infantry advanced through the forests, north and east of the city, probing for weak spots. Tank brigades ground forward, their treads smashing through wire and minefields. The Germans fought back desperately. MG 42 seconds rattling, mortars thumping, anti-tank crews firing until their barrels glowed. Yet already the city's lifelines were under threat. Soviet spearheads bypassed strongpoints, driving for the roads and bridges that connected Vitebsk to the rest of Army Group Center. By the evening of June 23, the trap was forming. South of the city, Rokossovsky's first Belarusian front surged forward in swamp and forest terrain the Germans had thought impassable. His soldiers cut paths through marshes, dragging artillery piece by piece, hauling supplies on makeshift rafts, moving where no one expected them. German officers who had scouted those bogs months earlier and marked them as safe flanks now cursed in disbelief. The Soviets were there, in force, advancing inexorably. The pressure grew by the hour. By June 24, Soviet divisions had pierced deep, threatening to encircle the entire German 53rd Corps. Orders flashed from Berlin: hold Vitebsk, no retreat. General Friedrich Gollwitzer, commanding the city's defenders, wired back his warnings. His men were outnumbered, the sea, flanks collapsing, supply lines cut. He pleaded for permission to withdraw. Hitler's response was ice. Vitebsk was a fortress. A fortress did not retreat. It stood, it fought, it died. For the men inside the pocket, the reality was grim. Ammunition was running low. Soviet artillery shelled the city, day and night, collapsing buildings, turning streets into rubble-strewn canyons. Civilians huddled in cellars, clutching children, listening to the thunder of shells above. German soldiers staggered through the ruins, dirty, unshaven, their nerves stretched thin. Officers tried to instill discipline, but fear gnawed at everyone. Each hour brought reports of Soviet breakthroughs closer, of roads lost, of comrades surrounded. On June 25, the circle closed. Soviet spearheads from north and south linked up west of the city, snapping the trap shut. Vitebsk was encircled, its defenders cut off from the outside world. More than 30,000 German soldiers were trapped. From the air, Soviet reconnaissance planes reported the pocket. Columns of men clustered in the streets, supply wagons jammed in alleys, vehicles hidden under trees, artillery pieces dug into backyards. Stalin's orders were clear: annihilate the garrison. The bombardment intensified. Soviet artillery poured fire into the city day and night, smashing defenses, collapsing strong points. Il-2 Sturmovik swooped low, their cannons ripping into columns that tried to reposition, their bombs igniting fuel and ammunition depots. Fires raged uncontrollably, smoke turning the sky black. The defenders fought back where they could, manning machine guns in church towers, firing mortars from courtyards, ambushing tanks with Panzerfausts in the narrow streets. Soviet infantry advanced cautiously, street by street, clearing houses with grenades and submachine guns. Each block was contested, each cellar a potential bunker. The fighting was close, savage, personal. For the German commanders, the situation was hopeless. Gollwitzer sent desperate messages requesting permission to break out. His men could not hold another day. They needed to abandon the city and fight their way west. Berlin's reply was the same. Vitebsk was a fortress. It would stand. It would not retreat. Gollwitzer wept in frustration, his orders forcing him to sacrifice tens of thousands of men for nothing. Some officers quietly prepared their units for breakout attempts anyway, knowing they disobeyed under penalty of court-martial but believing it the only chance for survival. On June 26, the Soviets stormed the city from all sides. Tanks rolled through the suburbs, firing point-blank into buildings. Infantry advanced in waves, hurling grenades into doorways, storming stairwells with bayonets. Machine guns rattled from rooftops. Snipers picked off defenders. German soldiers fell back from one block to the next, their ammunition dwindling, their ranks thinning. Fires consumed entire neighborhoods, the heat forcing civilians and soldiers alike into the open, where they were cut down in crossfire. The streets ran with smoke and blood. By evening, organized defense collapsed. Small groups of soldiers tried to slip out, abandoning weapons. disguising themselves among civilians, fleeing into the forests. Most were hunted down by Soviet patrols or cut down by artillery as they tried to cross open fields. Columns attempting breakout were shredded by Soviet fire, their survivors scattered and captured. On June 27, it was over. The last pockets of resistance in Vitebsk were crushed. Soviet soldiers raised their banners over the ruins, their uniforms blackened with soot, their faces grim with exhaustion. General Gallwitzer, surrounded and with no options left, surrendered with what remained of his staff. More than 20,000 prisoners were taken. Thousands more lay dead in the ruins. The once proud fortress had been annihilated in less than a week. For the Soviets, the fall of Vitebsk was the first great triumph of Operation Bagration. It was proof that Hitler's Festung doctrine was folly. Fortress cities could be surrounded, isolated, and destroyed. Entire corps could vanish in days. Stalin proclaimed the victory in Moscow, his newspapers filled with stories of the annihilation of German divisions, the liberation of Belarusian towns and villages. For the Red Army soldiers on the ground, it was vindication for years of suffering. They marched through the ruins of Vitebsk with pride, handing out bread to starving civilians, taking prisoners by the thousands. For the Germans, it was the beginning of the end. Army Group Center had lost its northern hinge. Entire divisions had ceased to exist. The myth of stability along the Eastern Front cracked. Soldiers fleeing westward carried stories of annihilation, of comrades buried in rubble, of orders to stand fast that led only to death. Fear spread like wildfire. If Vitebsk could fall so quickly, what chance did Orsha, Mogilev, Bobruisk have? The fall of Vitebsk sent shockwaves through Berlin. Hitler raged, denouncing his generals, accusing them of cowardice. He refused to see the truth that his orders had doomed tens of thousands to pointless sacrifice. He still believed that fortresses could hold, that Army Group Center could stabilize. But the reality was plain. Vitebsk was gone, its defenders captured or dead, its ruins smoldering. And the Soviet juggernaut was only gathering momentum. As Soviet soldiers pressed westward, through forests and across rivers, civilians emerged from hiding to greet them. Old men wept. Young women embraced the soldiers. Children cheered. Yet joy was mingled with grief. Entire neighborhoods were ash. Families were gone. Graves lined the fields. Liberation had come, but it came in smoke and ruin. For those who survived, the memory of Vitebsk would never fade. The roar of artillery, the burning houses, the endless nights of terror, and the sudden, final silence when it was all over. For history, the Battle of Vitebsk was more than a victory. It was a symbol of the transformation of the war. 3 years earlier, in 1941, it had been the Germans who encircled and annihilated Soviet armies. Now, in 1944, the tide had turned. The Red Army had become the master of encirclement, of firepower, of momentum. Vitebsk was the proof, the first of many cauldrons that summer, each swallowing entire German armies. The storm that began with thunder on June 22 had claimed its first fortress, and the Red Army was not about to stop. Ahead lay Orsha, Mogilev, Bobruisk, Minsk. Ahead lay the destruction of Army Group Center itself. The road west was open, and nothing the Germans could do would close it again. The thunder of Vitebsk's destruction had hardly faded when the storm moved westward. The next fortress in Hitler's chain was Orsha, a city straddling the vital Moscow-Minsk highway. For 3 years it had been the hinge of the German Central Front, a key bastion where the Wehrmacht had dug in deep. Hitler had ordered that it, too, would be a Festung, to be defended at all costs. Behind its trenches, bunkers, and artillery placements, divisions of hardened panzer grenadiers waited, convinced they could hold back the Red Army's fury. The Soviets knew differently. Orsha was more than a city, it was the lock on the road to Minsk. To smash Army Group Center, that lock had to be broken. For the men of the Soviet 2nd Guards Tank Corps and the 11th Guards Army, Orsha was not merely a name on a map. It was an obstacle standing between them and final victory. Stalin had ordered that the city fall, and his generals prepared accordingly. On the 24th of June 1944, the bombardment began. Soviet artillery, massed in unprecedented numbers. Thousands of guns thundered in unison, their shells shrieking across the forests and fields into German lines. Rockets from the dreaded Katyusha launchers streaked overhead, leaving trails of fire before exploding with ear-splitting detonations. The ground shook, the air burned. The forests lit up as if consumed by a storm. German trenches disintegrated under the onslaught. Bunkers collapsed. Machine gun nests were torn apart. Telephone lines were severed. For hours the barrage rolled on, a curtain of fire that never lifted, breaking men's nerves before the infantry even advanced. When the bombardment lifted, Soviet troops surged forward. Infantry in massed ranks moved through the smoke, bayonets fixed, submachine guns at the ready. Behind them rumbled the tanks T-34 seconds, IS-2 heavy tanks, and self-propelled guns. Engineers cleared minefields under fire, dragging obstacles aside, cutting through barbed wire, creating paths for the armored spearheads. The Germans resisted with everything they had. Panzer grenadiers poured fire from concealed positions, their MG-42 seconds rattling at a terrifying rate. Mortars thumped, artillery cracked, and anti-tank guns slammed shells into advancing Soviet armor. In the forests and villages east of the city, ambushes flared. Soviet tanks went up in fireballs, their crews scrambling out only to be cut down. Soviet infantry were mowed down in rows, leaving fields strewn with bodies. But the Soviets pressed on, heedless of losses. Their doctrine was no longer hesitant or clumsy. It was relentless, coordinated, and overwhelming. When machine gun nests slowed the advance, artillery was brought forward and blasted them at point-blank range. When anti-tank guns knocked out the lead T-34 seconds, heavier IS-2 seconds were rolled up, their 122 mm cannons smashing bunkers into dust. Soviet aircraft swooped overhead, IL-2 Sturmovik strafing German positions, rockets exploding among dugouts, bombs flattening crossroads. The Germans tried to hold, but Orsha was turning into a slaughterhouse. The 78th Sturm Division, once among Hitler's elite, was ground down block by block. The famed 25th Panzergrenadier Division, hardened by years of fighting, was reduced to fragments. Its companies swallowed in the maelstrom. Commanders screamed, orders over broken radios, runners dashed across shell-swept streets, only to vanish in blasts of smoke and blood. By June 25, the Soviets had broken through. South of Orsha, Soviet tank columns surged along the Moscow-Minsk highway, the very artery the Germans had sworn to hold. North of the city, infantry smashed through defensive lines, forcing German battalions to retreat in chaos. The once straight front had collapsed into fragments, and Orsha was isolated. Inside the city, the battle raged house to house. Streets choked with rubble became killing zones. German machine gunners fired from second-story windows, cutting down waves of attackers. Soviet soldiers stormed buildings with grenades, clearing them room by room. Cellars turned into bunkers, attics into sniper nests. Fires raged unchecked, smoke turning day into night. Civilians hid in basements, praying as the roar of battle shook their walls. Soviet tanks prowled the streets, blasting apart barricades, firing point-blank into buildings. German Panzerfaust teams darted from alleys, firing at close range, then vanishing into smoke. Some Soviet tanks were destroyed, their hulks burning in the squares, but more rolled in behind them. The tide was unstoppable. For the Germans, discipline was breaking. Entire units dissolved under the pressure. Soldiers fled westward, abandoning positions, discarding weapons, trying to reach safety. Officers shouted, pistols drawn, but panic spread. To stay was to die, and no amount of orders could change that. By June 26, Orsha was in Soviet hands. The last German defenders surrendered or slipped away into the forests. The Moscow-Minsk highway lay open, and Soviet columns poured westward. For the Red Army, it was another triumph, another fortress shattered, another lock smashed. For the Germans, it was a disaster. The divisions lost at Orsha would never be rebuilt. The central hinge of Army Group Center had been torn away. The battlefield was a vision of hell. Streets filled with corpses, German and Soviet alike. Burned-out tanks littered the squares. Houses were gutted, their walls scorched, their roofs gone. Civilians emerged from cellars to find their homes destroyed, their families missing, their city in ruins. Liberation had come, but at a terrible price. Strategically, Orsh's fall was decisive. With Vitebsk already gone to the north, and Mogilev under siege to the south, the destruction of Orsha meant Army Group Center was being split apart. German command structures collapsed. Reinforcements sent too late were swallowed in the tide. Communications broke down. Orders were confused. Units were encircled before they knew they were in danger. For Hitler, the news was enraging. He demanded explanations, denounced generals, ranted about betrayal. He refused to admit his doctrine of fortresses was madness, that his orders had sacrificed divisions for nothing. But the truth was unavoidable. Orsha had fallen. The Panzer Grenadiers were dead or captured. The road to Minsk was open, and the Red Army was advancing at a speed no one in Berlin could comprehend. For the soldiers who fought there, Orsha was unforgettable. Survivors spoke of the endless artillery, of nights lit by fire, of comrades buried in rubble. They remembered the screams in the burning streets, the sudden silence when a strong point was overrun, the faces of civilians staring blankly from shattered windows. For the Soviets, it was triumph mixed with grief, the exhilaration of victory alongside the loss of countless comrades. Operation Bagration had claimed another fortress. In less than a week, 2 of Hitler's bastions had fallen, entire corps annihilated, divisions erased. The Red Army was driving relentlessly westward, its momentum unstoppable. Ahead lay Mogilev, Bobruisk, and beyond them, Minsk itself, the heart of Army Group Center. The storm was building, the destruction widening, and with Orsha gone, the fate of the German Central Front was sealed. The collapse at Orsha had ripped open the northern hinge of Army Group Center, but south of the Moscow-Minsk highway, another fortress still held. Mogilev, an old city on the Dnieper River, had been declared a Festung by Hitler himself. It was to be defended to the last man, a bulwark to pin down Soviet armies while reserves regrouped further west. For its garrison of German soldiers, that order was not a command, it was a sentence. Mogilev was no ordinary city. It had been fortified with layers of trenches, bunkers, and artillery placements. Its streets were reinforced, its river crossings mined. The 12th Infantry Division, supported by fragments of other battered units, manned its defenses with grim determination. The city was symbolic. In 1941, it had been one of the Wehrmacht's proud conquests during Operation Barbarossa. Now, 3 years later, it was supposed to stand as proof that Germany could still hold back the storm. But as June 1944 unfolded, the defenders knew the truth. The storm was too great. The Soviet plan for Mogilev was clear. While the main thrust of Operation Bagration surged westward toward Minsk, the 49th Army of General Ivan Grishin was tasked with smashing the fortress. Their mission was not simply to take Mogilev, but to fix German forces in place, preventing them from retreating to safety or reinforcing Minsk. Stalin and his Stavka understood the art of encirclement. Every fortress pinned was another pocket waiting to be crushed. On June 23, the bombardment began. Thousands of Soviet guns opened fire. The sky filled with the scream of shells. The first waves smashed into the outer defenses east of the city, collapsing trenches, ripping apart wire, and shattering bunkers. Katyusha rockets shrieked overhead, exploding in fiery bursts that tore the forests into splinters. German soldiers cowered in dugouts, their nerves fraying as the earth itself seemed to convulse. For hours, the shelling never stopped. When the guns lifted, silence lasted. Only moments before the Soviet infantry surged forward. Wave after wave of Red Army soldiers stormed the outer lines. They came through forests and across open fields, rifles and submachine guns ready, supported by tanks and engineers. The Germans fired back desperately, MG 42 seconds, cutting down attackers in swathes, artillery shells exploding among the ranks, mortars thumping from concealed pits. But for every Soviet soldier who fell, another seemed to rise behind him. The first defensive belt collapsed. By June 24, Soviet spearheads were at the outskirts of Mogilev. The city itself braced for siege. Inside, German commanders tried to project confidence, rallying their men with promises of relief. But radios crackled with bad news. Orsha had fallen. Vitebsk was gone. Bobruisk was under assault. The armies to the north and south were collapsing. Mogilev was not a stronghold anymore, it was a trap. Still, the orders were clear. Hold. No retreat. No surrender. The soldiers dug in, barricading streets with rubble, positioning machine guns in cellars and church towers, turning every block into a fortress. Civilians were forced into shelters, their faces pale with fear, as German officers commandeered houses for command posts. The city prepared to fight to the death. The battle for Mogilev erupted in full fury on June 25. Soviet artillery pounded the city relentlessly, shells reducing buildings to ruins, fires sweeping through wooden neighborhoods. Infantry advanced through the smoke, storming strongpoints, clearing houses with grenades and bayonets. Tanks rumbled into the streets, their cannons blasting apart barricades, their tracks grinding over debris. Engineers dragged flamethrowers into action, torrents of fire consuming bunkers and basements where German soldiers clung to life. The Germans fought savagely. Machine gunners fired until their barrels overheated, then kept firing. Panzerfaust teams darted from alleys, blasting Soviet tanks at point-blank range before fires, being cut down themselves. Snipers picked off Soviet officers, their shots echoing across rubble-strewn streets. Small groups of infantry counterattacked with grenades and pistols, sometimes retaking blocks only to lose them again within hours. The fighting was brutal, intimate, face-to-face. Every house became a battlefield, every cellar a bunker, every courtyard a killing ground. By June 26, Mogilev was an inferno. Fires consumed whole neighborhoods, the sky was black with smoke. Civilians cowered in cellars as shells shook the ground and walls collapsed around them. Families whispered prayers, children sobbed, mothers clutched them tight. Liberation and destruction had arrived together, inseparable, indistinguishable. German commanders pleaded for permission to withdraw, but Hitler's orders remained unchanged. Hold Mogilev. Relief would come, they were told. Reinforcements would break the siege. But the truth was brutal. No reinforcements were coming. The German armies to the north and south were shattered, their remnants fleeing westward in chaos. Mogilev was alone. On June 27, Soviet forces stormed deeper into the city. Entire streets fell in hours. Soviet flags appeared on rooftops. German positions were reduced to scattered pockets, fighting on in hopeless defiance. Ammunition was gone. Food was gone. Soldiers fought with pistols, knives, even shovels. Some threw down their weapons and surrendered, their faces blank with exhaustion. Others fought to the end, killed in burning cellars or buried beneath collapsing walls. By June 28, Mogilev was finished. The last organized resistance collapsed. Soviet infantry swept through the ruins, capturing thousands of prisoners. Generals, staff officers, and entire regiments were marched away under guard, their heads bowed, their eyes hollow. The once proud fortress was a graveyard. Its defenders had obeyed their orders, but they had been sacrificed in vain. The fall of Mogilev was more than another Soviet victory. It was the completion of a trap. By fixing German forces in the fortress, the Soviets had ensured that the retreat westward would be cut off. While Mogilev's defenders perished, Soviet tank armies surged past to the north and south, encircling entire German armies in vast pockets. The destruction of Army Group Center was unfolding exactly as Stalin and his generals had planned. For the Germans, Mogilev was a bitter lesson. Hitler's obsession with fortress cities had condemned tens of thousands to death or captivity. Mogilev had not delayed the Soviets meaningfully. It had not bought time. It had not saved Army Group Center. It had simply consumed divisions that could never be replaced. For the Soviets, Mogilev was both triumph and tragedy. Victory was theirs, but the cost was high. Streets were littered with corpses, Soviet and German alike. Tanks burned in squares. Houses were rubble. Civilians wandered the ruins in shock, searching for family, for food, for anything left. Liberation was real, but so was devastation. By the end of June, Mogilev was in ashes, its defenders annihilated. The Red Army marched westward, past the ruins, toward the next battles, Bobruisk, Minsk, and beyond. Operation Bagration was gathering speed, momentum that nothing could stop. For history, Mogilev stood as a symbol. A fortress declared impregnable, destroyed in days. An army ordered to hold, sacrificed for nothing. A city liberated, but reduced to ruins. In Mogilev's ruins lay the truth of Hitler's war in the East. Orders divorced from reality. Soldiers abandoned to die. Civilians crushed between the gears of empires. The fortress had fallen. The road to Minsk was open. And the storm of Operation Bagration thundered on. The thunder of Operation Bagration rolled across Belarus like a storm without end. Vitebsk had fallen in flames. Orsha was gone. Mogilev, despite Hitler's decree of fortress to the last man, lay in ruins. But south of the Berezina River, one of the decisive, greatest battles of the campaign was about to unfold. The city of Bobruisk, seat of German command in the region and home to nearly 100,000 civilians, had become the last desperate stand of the Ninth Army. Its destruction would mark one of the darkest infernos of the entire war. The Ninth Army under General Hans Jordan had been stationed in this sector for months. Its divisions stretched across swampy terrain and forested rivers. The land itself was a nightmare. Bogs, winding waterways, choking woods. Yet Hitler's orders were the same as always. Hold every inch, yield nothing, turn Bobruisk into a festung, a fortress. Jordan, a capable but cautious commander, knew the danger. Soviet forces were massing on both his flanks. If they broke through, his entire army would be trapped. He pleaded for permission to shorten the line, to withdraw to more defensible ground. But Hitler would not hear of it. Bobruisk must not be abandoned, not one step back. On June 24, the Soviet storm struck. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, commanding the First Belarusian Front, had devised a plan as brilliant as it was ruthless. Instead of hammering the city head-on, his forces struck in two massive thrusts north and south of Bobruisk, bypassing the swampy center where German defenses were strongest. To the north, the Third Army smashed into the flanks. To the south, the 65th Army under General Pavel Batov drove across marshes long thought impassable. Soviet engineers laid corduroy roads across swamps, dragged artillery through bogs, and forced tanks where German commanders believed no tank could ever go. The Ninth Army reeled. Whole regiments were shredded by artillery, their trenches blasted apart by thousands of guns. Soviet infantry swarmed forward, supported by tanks and close air support. German divisions already hollow from years of attrition collapsed under the blow. The swampy terrain became a killing ground. Soldiers drowned in bogs as they tried to retreat. Horses and carts sank into mire. Trucks bogged down, abandoned, their cargoes still loaded. Above it all, Soviet Il-2 Sturmovik circled, swooping down in shrieking dives to strafe and bomb. Columns of men were scythed apart, convoys reduced to smoking wrecks. Within days, Rokossovsky's pincers snapped shut. By June 27, the Ninth Army was encircled east of Bobruisk. Tens of thousands of German soldiers found themselves trapped in a pocket, forests burning, villages blazing, the sky black with smoke. Panic spread through the ranks. Officers tried to rally men into coherent columns, but communications had collapsed. Radios were dead, headquarters smashed by artillery, runners killed in the chaos. Soldiers stumbled westward in the hope of breaking out, only to find Soviet tanks blocking the roads, their cannons firing point-blank into columns of men and wagons. Inside Bobruisk itself, the situation descended into hell. The city became a furnace of destruction. Soviet artillery poured thousands of shells into its streets. Houses collapsed into rubble. Fires consumed whole districts. Civilians fled into cellars, huddled together as the ground shook and the air filled with choking smoke. Above the roar of guns came the crash of collapsing buildings, the screams of the wounded, the howls of children. For those trapped in the city, it was not a battle, it was the end of the world. German soldiers tried to hold. Machine guns rattled from windows and basements. Snipers fired from church towers. Anti-tank guns concealed at street corners ambushed advancing Soviet armor. But the defenders were exhausted, starving, their ranks shredded by days of continuous combat. Ammunition ran low. Medical supplies were gone. Wounded lay untended in streets and houses, their cries adding to the horror. The Soviets pressed in relentlessly. Infantry stormed through streets, tossing grenades into basements, clearing buildings room by room. Tanks rumbled forward, blasting apart strong points at close range. Flamethrowers spewed torrents of fire into cellars and dugouts, consuming defenders in an instant. The fighting was merciless, intimate, savage. Civilians caught in the maelstrom suffered alongside the soldiers. Some fled westward with retreating Germans. Others waited in hiding for liberation. But in Bobruisk, liberation meant devastation. By June 29, the Ninth Army's pocket was collapsing. Attempts to break out turned into massacres. At night, columns of soldiers crept into forests, only to be illuminated by Soviet flares and annihilated by artillery. Machine guns cut down men as they stumbled through swamps. Villages became killing fields, surrounded and obliterated by overwhelming fire. Survivors spoke of chaos beyond words. Horses screaming in terror as shells tore through them, wagons overturned and burning, men throwing down weapons and fleeing into woods, only to be hunted down by Soviet patrols. On June 30, the end came. Soviet forces stormed into Bobruisk itself. The city was engulfed in fire. Streets were barricaded with corpses, rubble, and wrecked vehicles. German defenders fought with desperation, but their resistance crumbled. Soviet tanks blasted through the last strongpoints. Infantry surged forward in waves, bayonets fixed, rifles ready. The last pockets of resistance were wiped out. By nightfall, Bobruisk was in Soviet hands. What remained of the Ninth Army was gone. Of its 105,000 men, only fragments escaped westward. More than 70,000 were killed or captured. The rest vanished in the inferno of swamps, forests, and burning cities. General Hans Jordan himself was dismissed during the battle, his reputation destroyed. The once proud Ninth Army, which had fought at Moscow, Stalingrad, and Kursk, ceased to exist. For the Soviets, the victory was overwhelming. The destruction of the Ninth Army marked one of the greatest single defeats in German military history. Bobruisk, a fortress city meant to hold at all costs, had become a death trap. The Soviet advance surged on, the Berezina River now behind them, Minsk looming ahead. Stalin's dream of annihilating Army Group Center was becoming reality. For the Germans, the disaster was catastrophic. Fortress orders had condemned entire armies to destruction. Soldiers who might have been saved in an organized withdrawal were sacrificed to Hitler's obsession with holding every inch. The swamps and forests around Bobruisk became graveyards of the Wehrmacht, littered with corpses, wrecked vehicles, and shattered equipment. Survivors who staggered westward carried with them the memory of a nightmare. For the civilians of Bobruisk, liberation was both salvation and sorrow. They emerged from cellars into ruins. Their city was ash, their families scattered, their lives shattered. Liberation meant an end to German occupation, but it also meant mourning the dead, rebuilding from nothing, and enduring the harsh realities of Soviet rule. The inferno of Bobruisk was more than a battle, it was a turning point. In just days, An entire German army had been annihilated. The road to Minsk lay open. The storm of Operation Bagration was unstoppable, sweeping westward with a momentum that nothing could halt. In the blackened ruins of Bobruisk, the truth of Hitler's war in the east was laid bare. His armies were bleeding to death, his orders were madness, his empire of conquest was crumbling. For the Soviets, Bobruisk was proof that the tide had turned irreversibly. For the world, it was a signal. Nazi Germany's end had begun. The fall of Bobruisk sent shockwaves through the entire German Eastern Front. The Ninth Army had been annihilated in swamps and burning streets, its survivors staggering westward in broken columns. Vitebsk was gone. Orsha had fallen. Mogilev lay in ruins. In less than a week, Army Group Center was collapsing into fragments. Yet the disaster was not finished. Ahead lay Minsk, the capital of Belarus and the linchpin of German defenses in the region. It was here that the fate of entire armies would be sealed. As Bobruisk burned behind them, Soviet spearheads surged forward. Rokossovsky's First Belarusian Front advanced relentlessly from the south, while the First Baltic Front and the Third Belarusian Front pressed from the north and center. Their pace was astonishing. Tanks rumbled down roads littered with corpses and wrecked vehicles. Infantry marched through villages where German convoys had been annihilated. Artillery followed close behind, pounding retreating columns before they could regroup. Soviet aircraft ruled the skies, swooping down to strafe and bomb anything that moved. For the Red Army, the advance was no longer a methodical push. It was a chase, a relentless pursuit, and the prey was the shattered remnants of Hitler's once proud Army Group Center. German soldiers staggered westward in disorganized masses. Some clung to discipline, marching in columns behind exhausted officers. Others drifted in small bands, scavenging food from abandoned villages, stealing horses to carry wounded comrades, drinking from streams as they stumbled through fields. The retreat was chaos. Supply convoys clogged roads. Wagons overturned in ditches. Trucks sputtered out of fuel, abandoned where they stopped. Soldiers threw away rifles to carry bread, or clung to cows stolen from farms, hoping to slaughter them for food. Officers tried to rally units into fighting retreats, but communication was gone. Radios had been smashed or captured. Orders from higher command no longer reached the front. For many, survival was the only thought. Yet Hitler, far removed in his Wolf's Lair headquarters, refused to face reality. His orders were clear. Minsk was to be held at all costs. Retreat was forbidden. Commanders who even suggested it were dismissed. Army Group Center, already bled white, was ordered to defend an undefendable line. Fortress proclamations were issued. Cities like Borisov, Slutsk, and Minsk itself were to be turned into bastions. The men on the ground knew what this meant. Another Bobruisk, another slaughter. But the orders were absolute. As Soviet spearheads closed in, the scale of the disaster became clear. Nearly 300,000 German soldiers, remnants of the Fourth Army, Ninth Army, and parts of the Third Panzer Army were trapped east of Minsk. Rokossovsky's forces drove north from Bobruisk, cutting highways and railroads. To the north, Chernyakovsky's Third Belarusian Front stormed across the Berezina River, capturing bridges before they could be destroyed. By July 1, Soviet pincers were converging, sealing off escape routes west of the capital. The Berezina itself became a scene of nightmare. German columns tried desperately to cross the river, but Soviet aircraft and artillery turned crossings into killing grounds. Bridges collapsed under bombardment. Ferries sank, overloaded with men, horses, and vehicles. Soldiers swam in panic, dragged down by uniforms and equipment, their cries echoing across the water. Whole companies drowned before reaching the western bank. Survivors who struggled ashore often stumbled straight into Soviet blocking forces. For those trapped east of the Berezina, the only hope was to break west through fire and steel. Villages along the river became slaughter pens. At Borisov, German rearguards tried to hold long enough for comrades to escape. The city burned under Soviet artillery, streets were choked with refugees and soldiers, houses collapsed in flames. Yet Soviet tanks smashed through barricades, cutting down defenders in a storm of shells. The defenders were overwhelmed, and the retreat westward turned into a rout. The pursuit west of Bobruisk and Mogilev was merciless. Soviet cavalry and mechanized corps struck deep into German rear areas, blocking crossroads, destroying convoys, and sowing panic. Columns of German troops, stretched for miles, were ambushed and annihilated. Machine guns scythed through stragglers. Artillery smashed marching formations. Survivors stumbled into forests, only to be hunted down by Soviet patrols or surrounded and captured. Prisoners were herded into makeshift camps in fields, guarded by exhausted Soviet infantry who could barely keep pace with the flow of captives. For civilians, the advance was both liberation and horror. Villages long under German occupation erupted in chaos as the front swept through. Families huddled in cellars, praying for safety. Some emerged waving red banners or icons, greeting Soviet soldiers with tears of joy. Others wept over ruins, their homes destroyed in crossfire, their livestock stolen by retreating Germans or requisitioned by advancing Soviets. Mass graves were uncovered as German forces fled, revealing the atrocities of Einsatzgruppen and SS police units that had slaughtered Jews, partisans, and entire communities during the occupation. Liberation came, but it carried the ghosts of the murdered with it. Inside Minsk, panic gripped both soldiers and civilians. Refugees poured into the city, swelling its streets with carts, wagons, and desperate families. German staff officers tried to organize defenses, placing machine guns in buildings, digging trenches, barricading streets with rubble and vehicles. But the reality was clear. The Soviet army was closing from every side. Officers argued in cellars over whether to hold or flee. Hitler's orders said hold. Survival said flee. The decision was taken out of their hands. On July 2, Soviet armored spearheads reached the outskirts of Minsk. Artillery thundered. Tanks rolled forward, smashing barricades, firing point-blank into strong points. Infantry surged into the suburbs, fighting street by street. Civilians hid in basements as houses collapsed, fire spreading block to block. The defense was ferocious, but fragmented. Isolated groups of German soldiers fought to the last, ambushing tanks in alleys, firing machine guns from rooftops, detonating grenades in stairwells. But the day saw for the city was doomed. By July 3, Minsk was liberated. Red banners flew from government buildings. Columns of prisoners were marched through its streets, tens of thousands of gaunt, exhausted men, their faces hollow, their uniforms in tatters. For the first time since 1941, the capital of Belarus was free of Nazi occupation. For the Germans, it was the death knell of Army Group Center. Entire divisions had ceased to exist. The encirclement east of Minsk sealed the fate of nearly 100,000 more. Cut off in forests and swamps, surrounded by Soviet armor, these remnants were annihilated in days of merciless fighting. Few escaped. The rest were killed or captured. The destruction was so complete that German generals would later compare it to Cannae, the ancient battle where Hannibal had destroyed a Roman army in a vast encirclement. Now it was the Wehrmacht that had been surrounded, crushed, and erased. For the Soviets, the triumph was total. In less than 2 weeks, they had advanced hundreds of miles, destroyed entire German armies, and liberated the heart of Belarus. The road to Poland and East Prussia now lay open. For Stalin, the victory was both military and political. At the very moment Western allies fought their way inland from Normandy, the Soviet Union had delivered one of the greatest defeats in German history. But for those who lived through it, the soldiers drowned in the Berezina, the prisoners marched through the ruins of Minsk, the civilians who emerged from cellars into cities of ash. The road to Minsk was no triumph. It was a nightmare of smoke, blood, and fire. It was the collapse of an army and the devastation of a land. It was the inferno of Operation Bagration, and it was far from over. The thunder of battle had rumbled for days, echoing across forests and rivers, growing closer with every hour. By the dawn of July 3, 1944, the storm reached its climax. Minsk, the capital of Belarus, once a bustling hub seized by the Wehrmacht in the opening days of Barbarossa, was now the epicenter of catastrophe. The Soviet Red Army, advancing at breathtaking speed, had already swept through Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobruisk. Its armored columns pressed in from north and south, its artillery thundered from the east, and its aircraft prowled the skies. The once mighty Army Group Center, Hitler's strongest bastion in the east, was no longer a coherent fighting force. It was disintegrating into fragments, and those fragments were being crushed in the jaws of encirclement. The city's wide boulevards and industrial suburbs trembled as Soviet shells crashed into German defensive positions. Barricades of overturned trams and rubble collapsed under the blasts. Streets filled with smoke, choking soldiers and civilians alike. German machine guns rattled from upper stories, but their fire was answered with a deluge of Soviet rockets and tank shells that tore buildings apart. Civilians cowered in basements, clutching children, listening to the world above collapse in fire and thunder. For 3 years they had lived under German occupation. Forced labor, executions, mass deportations, the horror of the Holocaust, carried out in their very streets. Now liberation came, but liberation wore the face of war. German defenders fought with desperate ferocity, though many knew it was hopeless. Hitler's orders had declared Minsk a fortress city to be held at all costs. Yet fortress was a fiction. Supplies were gone, ammunition dwindled, food was scarce. The garrison was a patchwork of Wehrmacht stragglers, SS units, Luftwaffe ground crews, and police battalions pressed into combat. Lithuanian and Belarusian auxiliaries manned barricades beside exhausted German infantry. Their weapons clattered and roared, but every hour brought new Soviet troops surging into the fight. The first Soviet spearheads entered Minsk on July 2, storming the eastern districts. T-34 tanks clattered through avenues lined with rubble, their cannons blasting apart strongpoints at point-blank range. Behind them, infantry poured into the city, storming houses and factories. Engineers followed with flamethrowers and explosives, clearing bunkers and cellars. Each block was contested, each street fought over. At night, flares lit the sky in eerie green and red, illuminating running battles in the ruins. Snipers fired from church towers. Machine guns rattled from windows. Grenades echoed through stairwells, leaving plaster and bodies scattered across floors. It was urban war, in its rawest form, brutal and merciless. By dawn of July 3, the battle was decided. Soviet forces had pushed through the city center, surrounding pockets of resistance, smashing them one by one. The last defenders, small bands of Germans clinging to Hitler's command to hold, were either killed or forced to surrender. At midday, red banners unfurled from Minsk's government buildings. The capital of Belarus, occupied since the summer of 1941, was free. The roar of artillery faded. The echoes of machine guns died away. Minsk had fallen. The liberation was both triumph and tragedy. Civilians emerged from basements into a city scarred beyond recognition. Entire districts lay in ruins. Black smoke drifted skyward from warehouses and factories set ablaze during the fighting. Streets were littered with corpses. German soldiers sprawled beside wrecked vehicles, civilians caught in crossfire, Soviet infantry cut down in charges. Survivors wandered the streets in shock, searching for family, weeping over rubble that had once been homes. Some embraced Soviet soldiers, showering them with bread and salt, crying with relief. Others stood in silence, haunted by years of German rule and uncertain of the new future under Moscow's hand. For the Germans, the fall of Minsk marked disaster on a scale few could comprehend. Nearly 100,000 soldiers were trapped east of the city, encircled by Soviet armor and infantry in forests and swamps. These remnants of Vestrakes of the Gavabal, the Fourth Army, and parts of the Ninth and Third Panzer Armies had attempted to flee westward, but Soviet pincers had closed too swiftly. The Berezina river crossings were destroyed or captured. Columns marching through woods found themselves surrounded by tanks and cut down by artillery fire. Desperate breakouts turned into massacres. The encircled forces disintegrated under relentless Soviet pressure. Within days, most were killed or captured. Prisoners streamed westward in endless columns. Soviet reports claimed that in the Minsk pocket alone, over 50,000 Germans were taken prisoner. Exhausted, filthy, and starving, they stumbled through the ruins, guarded by Red Army riflemen who barely looked at them. Their faces told the story of collapse. Hollow-eyed officers clutching maps that no longer mattered, soldiers with torn boots and bloodied bandages, boys dragged from replacement depots who had never fired a rifle in anger until this retreat. They were the remnants of divisions that no longer existed. Minsk became a graveyard, not only for men, but for the myth of German invincibility. Since 1941, Army Group Center had been the spearhead of Barbarossa, the pride of Hitler's Eastern Front, the juggernaut that had once threatened Moscow itself. Now, in the streets and fields around Minsk, that army ceased to exist. In 2 weeks, 4 German armies had been smashed, 30 divisions annihilated, hundreds of thousands of soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. Never again would the Wehrmacht recover its strength in the East. For the Soviet Union, the victory was electrifying. Stalin himself marked July 3rd with a speech broadcast across Moscow, declaring that the Red Army had delivered a crushing blow, liberating Belarus and opening the road to Poland. In the capital, parades and fireworks celebrated the triumph. But in Minsk, celebration mingled with mourning. The city was free, but at a cost of devastation. Of a pre-war population of 300,000, fewer than 50,000 remained. The rest had been deported, murdered, or starved during 3 years of occupation. Jewish communities that had once flourished in the city were gone, annihilated in ghettos and camps. Mass graves in forests like Malý Trostenec bore silent witness to genocide. Liberation could not erase those scars. The capture of Minsk had immense strategic weight. It shattered the center of the German front, creating a void hundreds of miles wide. The Red Army now stood at the gates of Poland and the approaches to East Prussia. Army Group North was left exposed in the Baltics. Army Group North Ukraine was forced into retreat. The German Eastern Front, once a line of steel stretching from the Arctic to the Black Sea, had been torn open in its middle, leaving the Reich vulnerable as never before. Yet even in triumph, the Soviets pressed on relentlessly. Their generals understood that momentum was everything. The Germans were reeling, their command structure shattered, their troops exhausted and demoralized. Stalin demanded that the offensive continue, deeper into Lithuania and Poland, across the Niemen, and toward the Vistula. The fall of Minsk was not an endpoint, it was a stepping stone to Berlin. For German soldiers who survived, Minsk became a word of dread. Memoirs written later speak of endless retreats, columns of prisoners stumbling west, the haunting sight of comrades drowned in rivers or cut down in forests. For Soviet soldiers, Minsk was remembered as the symbol of victory, the moment they proved beyond doubt that the Red Army had mastered the art of war. They had destroyed an enemy army group, liberated a capital, and advanced hundreds of miles in weeks. For civilians, the memory was bittersweet, the joy of liberation bound forever with the grief of destruction. The fall of Minsk was more than a battle. It was the moment Operation Bagration reached its crescendo. In its ruins lay not just the bodies of soldiers, but the collapse of a strategy, the shattering of Hitler's Eastern dream, and the proof that the tide of war had turned irrevocably. From Minsk onward, the question was no longer whether Germany could hold the East. The question was only how soon the Red Army would reach Berlin. The summer of 1944 had already seen disaster after disaster for Hitler's eastern armies. Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Bobruisk. All fortress cities declared by the Führer to be held at all costs had fallen within days. But nothing compared to the maelstrom that unfolded around Minsk. It was here, in the forests, swamps, and fields of Belarus, that the Red Army executed one of the greatest encirclements in military history. It was here that an entire German army group was torn apart, consumed in a storm of fire and steel. The seeds of catastrophe were sown in late June. As Soviet offensives smashed through German defenses at multiple points, the Fourth Army and much of the Ninth found themselves caught in a tightening ring. Soviet spearheads surged forward with a speed that defied belief, tanks covering 30, 40, even 50 kilometers a day. Cavalry mechanized groups rode in their wake, sweeping into the rear to block roads and seize bridges. Partisans rose from forests, felling trees, blowing up tracks, ambushing convoys. German columns retreating westward stumbled into ambush after ambush, harried at every turn. By July 1st, the trap was closing. Soviet armored pincers from the north and south met west of Minsk, severing the last roads. Tens of thousands of Germans were suddenly cut off. Divisions already mauled in earlier battles, remnants of once proud infantry corps, shattered panzer formations, and rear echelon units pressed into combat, were trapped in a pocket that stretched across rivers and forests, but was shrinking by the hour. Estimates put the number at nearly 100,000 men, a force larger than many entire armies. Inside the pocket, chaos reigned. Columns of retreating soldiers, infantry, horse-drawn artillery, trucks, packed with supplies, choked narrow forest roads. Orders from above were confused, contradictory, and often impossible to carry out. Hitler's headquarters continued to demand that Minsk be held, that no withdrawal be allowed. Yet Minsk had already fallen. Radio messages went unanswered. Wires were cut. Luftwaffe planes dropped supplies blindly into forests, where they were captured by Soviets or lost in the swamp. The men inside the cauldron felt abandoned, sacrificed to an impossible command. The Soviets wasted no time. Artillery barrages pounded the pocket, shells bursting among convoys, turning roads into killing grounds. Airstrikes roared overhead. Il-2 attack planes swooped low, raking columns with rockets and cannon fire. Trucks exploded, horses bolted in terror, men dived into ditches only to be cut down moments later by strafing runs. Soviet infantry pressed from all sides, tightening the noose, pushing the Germans deeper into the shrinking trap. On July 2nd and 3rd, as Soviet units stormed Minsk itself, desperate breakout attempts were launched. German commanders, realizing the pocket would not hold, gathered whatever strength they had left. Small armored groups tried to smash westward, hoping to reach the Berezina River. Infantry staggered through forests, guided by rumors of open paths. But each attempt was met with Soviet firepower. T-34 seconds blocked roads. Artillery cut down formations before they could deploy. Partisans swarmed rear guards, ambushing stragglers, seizing prisoners. Survivors speak of endless chaos, columns stumbling through mud and smoke, horses screaming as shells tore into wagons, men collapsing from exhaustion or wounds and left behind by comrades too desperate to stop. Forests echoed with cries of "Hurrah!" as Soviet infantry charged into German positions. Villages burned as firefights erupted in streets, rivers clogged with bodies of men who tried to swim across under fire. By July 5th, the pocket was finished. Organized resistance collapsed. Groups of Germans surrendered in droves, throwing down weapons, emerging from forests with hands raised. Others fought to the end, small bands destroyed in final firefights. Soviet reports spoke of tens of thousands of prisoners, more than 50,000 taken alive. Alongside them, fields littered with corpses testified to the ferocity of the fighting. The Berezina, infamous since Napoleon's retreat in 1812, once again became a graveyard for an invading army. The destruction of the Minsk pocket was more than a tactical victory. It was annihilation on a scale unseen in modern warfare. 4 entire German armies, the 4th, 9th, parts of the 3rd Panzer, and remnants of the 2nd, had ceased to exist as effective fighting forces. 32 divisions were destroyed. The core of Hitler's Army Group Center, once numbering over 700,000 men, had been erased. Historians later compared the battle to Cannae, the legendary encirclement in 216 BCE when Hannibal destroyed a Roman army. But Operation Bagration's encirclement was larger, deadlier, more decisive. It was modern war's Cannae, a destruction not by cavalry and infantry alone, but by tanks, aircraft, artillery, and the relentless coordination of fronts that spanned hundreds of kilometers. For Germany, the shock was immense. News filtered back slowly, but even the most optimistic reports could not hide the truth. Army Group Center no longer existed. Officers spoke in whispers of catastrophe, of divisions erased, of comrades vanished. For Hitler, the defeat was unbearable. He raged at generals, accused them of cowardice, refused to acknowledge that his own orders to hold at all costs had doomed his armies. Field Marshal Busch, commander of Army Group Center, was dismissed in disgrace. Field Marshal Walter Model, the fireman of the Eastern Front, was summoned to salvage what remained. But even Model could not conjure divisions from ashes. For the Soviets, the encirclement was both a triumph and a lesson. It proved that the Red Army had mastered the operational art of modern war. No longer were they the clumsy, desperate defenders of 1941. No longer were they the shaky attackers of 1942. By 1944, they had become a machine capable of planning, coordinating, and executing vast offensives across multiple fronts. Their logistics, once a weakness, now kept pace with tanks racing hundreds of kilometers. Their commanders, hardened by years of war, wielded forces with skill that rivaled any in history. The propaganda impact was enormous. Stalin seized on the victory, proclaiming that the destruction of Army Group Center was proof of Soviet supremacy. In Moscow, parades celebrated the triumph. Columns of captured German soldiers, tens of thousands of them, were marched through the capital in a spectacle designed to humiliate Hitler and galvanize Soviet morale. Civilians lining the streets jeered and spat at the defeated invaders. The world watched in awe and fear. The psychological blow to Germany was incalculable. Soldiers on other fronts, hearing of the annihilation, began to doubt. Civilians in East Prussia, for the first time, faced the reality that the Red Army was coming. The myth of the Wehrmacht's invincibility was gone. In its place was panic, despair, and resignation. For the civilians of Belarus, the encirclement brought liberation, but also devastation. Villages were burned in fighting. Fields were littered with wreckage. Forests hid mass graves of Germans and Soviets alike. Survivors emerged from hiding to find their homes gone, their families scattered, their futures uncertain. Yet for them, the sight of Soviet tanks rolling west was also hope, the end of occupation, the beginning of rebuilding. The great encirclement around Minsk was not merely another Soviet victory. It was the death knell of Hitler's Eastern Front. In the span of weeks, the balance of power in Europe shifted irrevocably. The Wehrmacht could no longer launch great offensives. From this point forward, Germany fought only in retreat, desperately trying to delay the inevitable. Operation Bagration had not only liberated Belarus, it had destroyed the core of Germany's military might. And still, the Red Army did not pause. Even as prisoners were herded east and fields burned with wreckage, the advance pressed on. Soviet generals knew that time was their ally, that momentum was everything. Ahead lay the Niemen River, the gates of Lithuania, and beyond them, the borders of Poland and East Prussia. The Minsk encirclement had broken the back of Army Group Center, but Stalin's gaze was already fixed westward. The storm had only begun. The road to Minsk had been paved in fire and blood. For nearly 2 weeks, the Red Army had stormed through Belarus with a speed and ferocity the world had scarcely imagined possible. Vitebsk had fallen. Orsha, Mogilev, Bobruisk, all cities Hitler had declared fortresses to be held. To the last man had collapsed within days. Soviet spearheads advanced in great arcs, cutting deep into the German rear. Columns of tanks thundered across the plains. Partisans rose from forests to strike convoys and rails. Every hour brought another disaster for the Wehrmacht. And ahead of it all loomed the greatest prize of all, Minsk, the capital of Soviet Belarus, the linchpin of German control in the central sector of the Eastern Front. For the German 4th and 9th Armies, already reeling from devastating losses, Minsk became both a beacon and a trap. Hitler had declared it a fortress city, a Festung, to be defended at all costs. Orders from his headquarters were explicit: Minsk must not fall, no matter the sacrifice. But sacrifice had already become the defining feature of Army Group Center. Its armies were bleeding out on every road, cut off in forests, driven westward in chaos. By the end of June 1944, the encirclement was already closing. Soviet spearheads had broken through on all sides. German units retreating from Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobruisk collided in confusion, clogging the approaches with broken convoys. The Soviets were not merely attacking, they were surrounding, enveloping, suffocating. By July 1st, Soviet tanks had swung around the city from the north and south. The trap snapped shut. Tens of thousands of Germans were caught east of Minsk, cut off from escape. Inside the city itself, the garrison braced for the storm. Soldiers built barricades from rubble and overturned vehicles. Machine guns were set up in windows and rooftops. Panzerfaust teams crouched in alleys, waiting for Soviet tanks to appear. Civilians huddled in cellars, the thunder of artillery rolling ever closer. For the defenders, it was less a question of victory than of survival. The assault came at dawn on July 3rd. Soviet artillery opened fire with a barrage that shook the earth, shells screaming across the sky and detonating in the city's outskirts. Rockets from Katyusha launchers howled, leaving trails of fire before crashing into streets and houses. The noise was deafening, the air filled with smoke and dust. Buildings collapsed, fires raged, and German positions were smashed before the infantry even advanced. Then came the tanks. T-34 rolled into the suburbs, their turrets swiveling to blast apart machine gun nests. Infantry followed, storming forward with bayonets fixed, hurling grenades into doorways, fighting house to house. The defenders fought back with desperation. German soldiers fired from attics and cellars, snipers picking off Soviet officers. Panzerfaust teams darted from alleys, loosing rockets at close range before vanishing into smoke. Small groups counterattacked again and again, rallying in courtyards, ambushing tanks at corners, hurling grenades from rooftops. The fighting was savage and intimate. Entire blocks became fortresses. Houses were stormed, lost, and retaken in cycles of fire and blood. Streets became graveyards of wrecked vehicles, the air thick with the acrid stench of burning fuel and cordite. But the Red Army pressed inexorably forward. Their numbers were overwhelming, their momentum unstoppable. Tanks blasted apart barricades. Engineers cleared mines under fire. Artillery shifted its aim deeper into the city, collapsing strongpoints and cutting off defenders from one another. By midday, Soviet units were pushing into the center. Red flags appeared on government buildings. Soldiers cheered as they tore down swastikas and hoisted the hammer and sickle in their place. For the civilians of Minsk, liberation came in fire and chaos. Many had lived through 3 years of brutal occupation, executions, deportations, forced labor, starvation. Now, as Soviet troops stormed through their streets, they emerged from hiding with tears in their eyes, some embracing soldiers, others too dazed to react. The city itself was in ruins. Fires burned unchecked, corpses lay in the streets, buildings that had survived occupation collapsed under bombardment. Liberation had come, but it had come at the price of devastation. By evening, the last resistance was broken. German survivors fled westward in disorganized columns, harried by Soviet patrols and partisans. The pocket east of the city collapsed into chaos, tens of thousands trapped with no escape. Inside Minsk, thousands of prisoners were rounded up, marched into captivity under guard. Officers who had once strutted with pride now stumbled with blank, hollow eyes, their commands meaningless in the face of annihilation. The fall of Minsk on July 3rd was more than the liberation of a city. It was the culmination of the first great phase of Operation Bagration. In less than 2 weeks, the Red Army had advanced nearly 300 kilometers, shattered 4 German armies, and annihilated the heart of Army Group Center. 32 divisions had ceased to exist. The Wehrmacht, once seen as invincible, was now revealed as fragile, crumbling, and doomed. For the Soviets, it decisive was a triumph beyond measure. For the Germans, it was a disaster without precedent. The propaganda value was immense. On July 17, Stalin staged his infamous Parade of the Vanquished in Moscow, marching 57,000 German prisoners through the capital in columns of humiliation. Civilians lined the streets, jeering, spitting, throwing refuse at the defeated invaders. Behind them, water trucks washed the streets clean, symbolically purging the city of fascist filth. The world watched in awe and horror. The message was clear. The Red Army was not just resisting, it was crushing Hitler's armies, and it would not stop until Berlin itself lay in ruins. For the men who fought at Minsk, the memory was seared into their souls. German survivors recalled hunger, exhaustion, and the terror of encirclement, stumbling westward through forests as artillery thundered around them, comrades falling one after another. Soviet soldiers remembered storming through smoke-filled streets, fighting room to room, bayonet to bayonet, until exhaustion blurred their vision. Civilians remembered liberation mingled with grief, homes burned, families lost, but freedom finally reclaimed. The fall of Minsk was both an ending and a beginning. It marked the destruction of Army Group Center, the collapse of German defenses in Belarus, and the opening of the road to Poland and East Prussia. But it also marked the beginning of a new phase. A relentless pursuit westward, a storm that would sweep through Lithuania, Latvia, and into the gates of Germany itself. Operation Bagration was far from over. The Red Army had broken the back of the Wehrmacht, but its eyes were already set on the next objectives: Vilnius, Grodno, the Neman River, and beyond them, the very heart of the Reich. The liberation of Minsk was celebrated as a moment of justice, of vengeance, of triumph. But for the Germans trapped east of the city, it was the beginning of the end. Tens of thousands would march into captivity. Tens of thousands more would lie where they had fallen, in fields, forests, and riverbanks. The Minsk pocket was closing, and with it, the fate of Army Group Center was sealed. The fall of Minsk was not the end. It was the tightening of a noose, a vast encirclement that swallowed the shattered remnants of Germany's 4th and 9th armies. For days, the Soviet pincers had been swinging shut. From the north, the 3rd Belarusian Front had driven relentlessly southward. From the south, Rokossovsky's 1st Belarusian Front had surged upward in sweeping arcs. Behind them, the 2nd Belarusian Front pressed from the east. Together, they carved a ring of steel around Minsk, trapping over 100,000 German soldiers in what would become one of the largest encirclements of the entire war. The Germans who found themselves inside the pocket were already exhausted. Their divisions bled dry in the battles for Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobruisk. Retreat had become a nightmare of bombed roads, broken bridges, strafing aircraft, and ambushes by partisans who seemed to emerge from every thicket and marsh. When they reached the Minsk region, they discovered that escape routes westward had already been severed. Soviet tanks prowled the countryside, artillery blanketed crossroads, and the Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen. The trap was complete. Life inside the pocket quickly descended into desperation. Food supplies had run out during the retreat. Horses were slaughtered for meat, their carcasses boiled over makeshift fires. Soldiers dug up half-rotten potatoes from abandoned fields, dividing them in silence among hungry comrades. Water was drawn from streams, choked with debris and corpses, spreading dysentery through the ranks. Ammunition was scarce. Machine guns that once spewed hundreds of rounds fell silent, their belts empty. Soldiers carried rifles with only a handful of cartridges, some with none at all. The once formidable Wehrmacht was reduced to bands of starving, hollow-eyed men, clutching useless weapons in trembling hands. And yet, Hitler's orders were uncompromising. Stand and fight. Hold Minsk. Never surrender. Even though Minsk itself had already fallen, the weight of those commands hung over officers who knew the truth. Obedience meant annihilation. Disobedience meant disgrace and punishment. Many chose to obey, not out of faith in victory, but out of habit, fear, or a futile sense of duty. The Soviets moved with ruthless efficiency. From every direction, their forces pressed inward. To the south and southeast, Rokossovsky's armies surged forward. From the north, Chernyakovsky's Third Belarusian Front cut deep into the countryside. From the east, Zakharov's Second Belarusian Front tightened its grip, closing the escape routes one by one. And from the north, Bagramian's First Baltic Front slammed down to complete the encirclement. What emerged was a cauldron of destruction on a scale not seen since Stalingrad, a massive ring that tightened each hour until it crushed everything within it. For the Germans trapped inside, survival became a series of desperate gambles. Columns of soldiers tried to break out by night, stumbling through forests, following rumors of a gap in the Soviet lines. At dawn, Soviet patrols would discover their movements, ambushing them with bursts of fire. Partisans familiar with every ravine and path intercepted fugitives, guiding Soviet troops to their hiding places. Survivors fled deeper into the woods, only to run headlong into artillery barrages that shattered the night with thunder and flame. By day, the roads were death traps. Convoys of trucks and carts rolled westward, only to be ripped apart by Soviet aircraft. The drone of engines overhead sent panic through the ranks. As IL-2 Sturmovik swooped low, cannons and rockets cutting men and vehicles to pieces. Horses screamed in terror as wagons exploded, their bodies tumbling into the dirt. Survivors scrambled into ditches, their faces pressed into the earth as fire rained down from the skies. One of the most harrowing episodes came at the Berezina River. Retreating German units, desperate to escape, poured toward its banks, recalling the nightmare of Napoleon's retreat more than a century earlier. Bridges had already been destroyed or captured. With no other choice, men waded into the current, rifles held above their heads, or clung to rafts, cobbled together from barrels, doors, and planks. Soviet artillery zeroed in, shells splashing into the river and tearing bodies apart. Machine guns raked the banks, cutting down swimmers as they struggled in the water. Survivors later spoke of seeing the river run red, bloated corpses drifting downstream alongside shattered carts and wrecked gear. What had once seemed like a path of escape became a watery graveyard. Inside the shrinking pocket, chaos gave way to despair. Officers no longer commanded divisions or regiments. They commanded ragged groups of a few dozen men. Radios were dead, their batteries gone, or their sets smashed in retreat. Runners carrying messages disappeared into the forests and never returned. Some officers shot themselves rather than face the humiliation of capture. Others tried to wave white flags, but the Soviets pressed on with orders to annihilate. For civilians in the region, the battle was both liberation and torment. They saw German fugitives stumbling through their villages, begging for food or water, only to be cut down by pursuing Soviet patrols. Some villagers guided the Red Army to hiding soldiers. Others took vengeance themselves, striking stragglers who had tormented them for years. Liberation came, but it came in fire, and many villages were consumed in the chaos. By July 5th, the Minsk pocket had collapsed into a charnel house. Soviet artillery encircled the remaining forces, pounding them day and night. Shells whistled overhead, crashing into fields crammed with wagons and men. The noise was ceaseless, a storm of steel that offered no shelter. Soviet tanks rolled into the cauldron, firing point-blank into desperate clusters of soldiers. Infantry followed with bayonets fixed, submachine guns firing bursts that tore into the last defenders. German troops fought back with what little they had, rifles swung as clubs, grenades hurled in final defiance, bayonets in frantic charges, but it was hopeless. They were drowning in fire. The end came swiftly. Tens of thousands stumbled out of forests with hands raised, their faces blackened with soot, their eyes hollow with shock. Soviet soldiers herded them into columns, stripping them of weapons and valuables, marching them eastward under guard. Among them were generals and staff officers, their medals useless, their authority gone. Others lay where they had fallen, sprawled in ditches, fields, and woods. Entire divisions had ceased to exist. The numbers told the scale of the catastrophe. More than 100,000 German soldiers were captured in the Minsk pocket alone. Tens of thousands more were killed. The Fourth Army, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, was annihilated. The Ninth Army, already shattered at Bobruisk, was gone. Army Group Center had lost its very heart. The destruction was so complete that it stunned even the Soviets who had carried it out. For Stalin and his generals, the encirclement was proof of mastery. Never before had the Red Army executed such a sweeping, coordinated offensive across multiple fronts with such devastating precision. What had once been the Wehrmacht's greatest strength, its ability to outmaneuver, encircle, and destroy, had now become the Soviets' weapon. The Minsk pocket was not merely a military victory, it was a turning point in history, the moment when the myth of German invincibility was shattered forever. And yet, for the men who lived through it, German and Soviet alike, the memory was more personal. For the Germans, it was hunger, exhaustion, and the terror of encirclement, ending in death or captivity. For the Soviets, it was triumph, mixed with vengeance, proof that years of suffering were finally turning to justice. For the civilians of Belarus, it was liberation scarred by grief, freedom rising amid the ashes of their homes. The Minsk pocket was closed. Army Group Center ceased to exist. The road to Poland and East Prussia was open, and Operation Bagration rolled on with unstoppable momentum. For the Reich, the summer of 1944 had become a season of disasters. And for the Red Army, the victory at Minsk was not the end, but the beginning of a march that would carry them all the way to Berlin. The dust of battle still lingered over the ruins of Minsk. When orders reached Soviet commanders, the captured Germans were to be marched east, not in silence, not in obscurity, but in a spectacle that would burn itself into the memory of the world. Stalin had long understood the power of symbols, and now, after Operation Bagration had annihilated Army Group Center, he intended to turn that destruction into theater. The Red Army had destroyed entire armies, captured hundreds of thousands, and liberated Belarus. Now, Moscow would see the proof with its own eyes. On the 17th of July 1944, the capital awoke to an event unlike any in its history. It was not a parade of Soviet troops, not a triumphant display of tanks or artillery rolling across Red Square. It was something darker and more humiliating. The procession of 57,000 German prisoners of war, the survivors of the Minsk pocket and the surrounding battles. It was to be a march of the defeated, a public shaming, and a declaration that the tide of war had turned irreversibly. From dawn, the people of Moscow poured into the streets. Tens of thousands pressed against barricades, waiting in silence and anticipation. Some had lived through the black days of 1941, when German armies stood at the gates of their city. Others had lost fathers, brothers, husbands to the war, their families swallowed by famine, occupation, or the firing squads of the SS. For them, this day was not merely about victory, it was justice. The prisoners came at mid-morning. Divided into long, grim columns, they marched under heavy guard. There were no bands to play, no banners to wave, no songs to accompany their steps. The only sound was the shuffle of boots on stone, the clink of chains, the cough of dust-choked throats. These were not the proud soldiers who had once goose-stepped through Paris or Warsaw. They were gaunt, hollow-eyed men, their uniforms filthy and torn, their faces gray with exhaustion. Some limped, leaning on sticks. Others walked barefoot, their boots long since worn to rags. A few still wore medals pinned to tunics, stiff with sweat and dirt, relics of battles that now meant nothing. Generals marched beside privates. Rank had vanished in defeat. Staff officers with polished insignia stumbled shoulder to shoulder with infantrymen whose belts hung loose over shrunken frames. The arrogance of the Wehrmacht, the aura of invincibility that had once terrified Europe, had been stripped away. What remained was a procession of broken men, shuffling past the people of a city they had once dreamed of conquering. The crowd watched in silence at first. Some spat at the prisoners, hurling insults in Russian and curses that echoed with years of rage. Others remained silent, their hatred too deep for words. A few shouted for vengeance, demanding blood for blood, life for life. Mothers held children on their shoulders, pointing at the defeated soldiers as if to say, "These are the men who brought us suffering. And now look at them, beaten, shamed, finished." The prisoners themselves kept their eyes low, fixed on the cobblestones beneath their boots. They marched as if in a trance, their expressions blank, their bodies moving only because the columns pressed them forward. For some, the humiliation was unbearable. Officers who had once barked commands now shuffled voiceless through hostile streets. Others felt only numbness. Defeat had hollowed them out, leaving nothing but an empty shell that moved mechanically toward captivity. Behind the last of the prisoners came the water trucks. They sprayed the streets clean, washing away the dust and dirt left by the defeated enemy. The symbolism was unmistakable. Moscow had been stained by the presence of the invader, and now it was being purified, cleansed of fascist filth. The crowd cheered, a roar that rose into the summer sky. For them, it was more than a parade. It was a ritual, an exorcism of the ghosts of 1941, a promise that the nightmare had been avenged. Stalin had orchestrated it all with cold precision. He understood that images mattered as much as victories. The Western Allies had landed in Normandy only weeks earlier, and already their newspapers were filled with stories of progress in France. Stalin wanted the world to see that the Soviet Union, too, was smashing Hitler's armies indeed, destroying them on a scale far beyond anything seen in the West. 57,000 prisoners marching through Moscow was worth more than any communiqué, any diplomatic cable. It was proof in flesh and bone that the Red Army had become the hammer of history. Internationally, the parade reverberated like a shockwave. Allied newspapers printed photographs of endless columns of German prisoners, their heads bowed, their boots dragging. Analysts marveled at the scale of Soviet success. In London and Washington, politicians took note. The Soviet Union was not merely holding the line. It was crushing Hitler's war machine. The balance of power in Europe had shifted, and the parade made that fact undeniable. For Hitler, the humiliation was intolerable. Reports of the parade reached him in his headquarters, and he raged against his generals, his soldiers, against fate itself. But nothing could erase the truth. His Central Army Group had been destroyed, his prestige shattered, his aura of invincibility gone. The image of his Bobruisk, soldiers marching through Moscow in defeat, was a wound to his pride that would never heal. For the Germans themselves, the experience seared into memory. Some later wrote of the humiliation with bitterness, others with shame. A few admitted that it was in that moment, shuffling past jeering crowds, that they realized the war was truly lost. They had come to conquer, and instead they had been conquered, reduced to objects of ridicule in the capital of their enemy. Yet, for the Soviet people, the parade was not simply about vengeance. It was also about memory. 3 years earlier, in June 1941, German armies had swept into the Soviet Union with unimaginable brutality. They had captured millions of prisoners, marched them into captivity, starved them, shot them, worked them to death. They had burned villages, massacred civilians, and carried out atrocities on a scale the world had never seen. Now, The sight of German soldiers in chains was a reminder that history had turned. The invaders who had brought fire and death were now themselves at the mercy of those they had once sought to annihilate. And yet, even amid triumph, there was sorrow. Tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers had fallen in the battles for Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Bobruisk, and Minsk. Families across the Union mourned husbands, sons, brothers who would never return. The parade was a celebration, but it was also an elegy, a reminder that victory came at terrible cost. The cheers of the crowd were mixed with tears for those who had given their lives. As the day drew to a close, Moscow settled into night. The prisoners were marched away to camps, their fate sealed. The people returned to their homes, carrying with them the memory of what they had seen, not just an army defeated, but a nation avenged. For Stalin, the parade was proof of his triumph. For the world, it was a declaration that the Red Army had become the decisive force in Europe. For the prisoners, it was humiliation without end. The march of the vanquished became one of the defining images of the war, a spectacle of victory and vengeance, of humiliation and justice. It marked the culmination of Operation Bagration's first phase, the proof that Army Group Center was not merely beaten but annihilated. It showed that the war had turned, that the Reich was bleeding to death, and that the road to Berlin lay open. The silence of Red Square after the last prisoner had passed was not emptiness. It was the silence of inevitability. The storm that had begun in the forests of Belarus was now rolling westward, unstoppable, unrelenting. The Reich had felt its fury, and the world had seen its proof. The vanquished had marched, and history itself had marched with them. Operation Bagration was more than a military offensive. It was a political statement, a demonstration of will, and the culmination of a design that Joseph Stalin had been shaping since the first days of the war. To understand why the Soviet hammer fell with such devastating force in June 1944, one must look not only at the battlefield, but at the mind of the man who orchestrated it. Stalin was not a general in the traditional sense, but he was the conductor of the orchestra, and in Bagration, the Red Army played his symphony of vengeance, power, and ambition. The plan itself was born in secrecy. The Western Allies had pressed Stalin for months to launch a major offensive in the east to coincide with their landings in France. Normandy would not succeed if German reserves could be shifted westward. Stalin promised that an attack would come, but he revealed little of his true intentions. Even among his own generals, the scope of Bagration remained hidden until the final hours. What he envisioned was not just a push, not merely a diversion, but a blow that would rip the heart out of the German Eastern Front. He intended nothing less than the destruction of Army Group Center. In the Kremlin, strategy and politics intertwined. Stalin understood that military victories were also bargaining chips in diplomacy. The Anglo-American landings in Normandy were important, but they also posed a threat. If the West advanced too quickly, they might claim more of Europe when the war ended. Stalin wanted to make sure that the Soviet Union carried the heaviest weight, liberated the most territory, and stood as the unquestioned master of Eastern Europe. Operation Bagration was as much about shaping the post-war world as it was about defeating the Wehrmacht. To achieve this, deception was essential. Soviet maskirovka reached a level of brilliance unmatched in the war. Radio silence, false build-ups, and elaborate camouflage convinced the Germans that the main blow would fall in the south, toward Ukraine. Hitler and his generals shifted reserves to the wrong place, leaving the central sector dangerously exposed. When the offensive began, the Wehrmacht's intelligence network was blindsided. The German high command knew an attack was coming, they always did. But not here, not now, not with such overwhelming force. Behind the deception lay an industrial miracle. The Red Army that surged forward in June 1944 was not the same force that had reeled under Blitzkrieg 3 years earlier. Soviet factories, relocated east of the Urals, had churned out tanks, guns, and aircraft in numbers that dwarfed German production. The T-34 had become the workhorse of the front. versatile, reliable, and deadly in mass. The Il-2 rained fire from the skies. Artillery, the god of war, was deployed in concentrations that shook the earth itself. Soviet logistics, once chaotic, now sustained armies advancing hundreds of kilometers at a time. Bagration was not only a triumph of strategy but of industrial will. Stalin's personal role was everywhere. He approved the plans, chose the commanders, and set the tone. Yet he also understood the value of delegation. By 1944, he trusted his senior generals, men like Rokossovsky, Zhukov, and Vasilevsky, to execute the details. Rokossovsky in particular played a pivotal role, commanding the First Belarusian Front with brilliance and daring. Stalin had once distrusted him, even jailed him during the purges, but now he relied on his judgment. When Rokossovsky argued for a two-pronged attack at Bobruisk, Stalin listened, a rare moment when the dictator deferred to a subordinate's insight. But Stalin's design was never purely military. He thought in symbols. The date of the offensive, the 22nd of June 1944, was no accident. It was the third anniversary of Operation Barbarossa, the day the Germans had invaded the Soviet Union. 3 years earlier, Hitler's panzers had rolled across Belarus with arrogance and cruelty. Now, on that same day, Stalin unleashed his vengeance, turning the anniversary of Soviet humiliation into a day of German catastrophe. History was not merely unfolding, it was being written with deliberate intent. As the offensive progressed, Stalin made sure that the world was watching. Pravda and Izvestia filled with triumphant reports. Radio broadcasts carried news of liberated cities and annihilated German divisions. Photographers and filmmakers followed the armies, capturing images of victory for propaganda reels that would be shown across the Union. Stalin wanted every Soviet citizen to know that their sacrifices had borne fruit, that the Red Army was not only defending but advancing, destroying the invader, and reclaiming the motherland. For the Allies, too, the message was clear. While Anglo-American troops fought bitterly through the hedgerows of Normandy, the Red Army was smashing entire German armies, advancing hundreds of kilometers, and liberating whole nations. Stalin's triumph strengthened his hand at the negotiating table. He could point to Bagration as proof that the Soviet Union was carrying the decisive burden of the war, that its voice must be paramount in shaping the peace to come. Every German prisoner marched through. Moscow was also a signal to London and Washington. The USSR was not just a partner, it was the indispensable power. For the Germans, the scale of the defeat was incomprehensible. Entire divisions disappeared in days. Communications collapsed. Hitler's orders to hold every inch of ground turned retreats into massacres. German commanders begged for permission to withdraw, to regroup, to salvage what they could. But Stalin's design had accounted for this too. By striking simultaneously at multiple points, the Soviets prevented any coherent retreat. What followed was not just a battle, but a disintegration. The Wehrmacht was not defeated tactically. It was dissolved strategically, consumed in encirclements so vast that even the survivors could not comprehend them. The symbolism reached its height in the liberation of Minsk. For 3 years, the city had groaned under German occupation. Ghettos had been liquidated, civilians massacred, resistance crushed. When Soviet troops entered in July, they were greeted with tears, bread, and salt. Stalin trumpeted the victory to the world. Minsk was not just a city, it was the capital of Belarus, the heart of German control in the region, and its fall was a proclamation. The invader was being driven out, the tide of war reversed. The culmination of Stalin's grand design came not only on the battlefield, but in the theater of politics. The parade of prisoners in Moscow was his crowning stroke, a ritual humiliation that broadcast Soviet supremacy. 57,000 Germans marched under guard. Their defeat paraded before the people, their dignity washed away with the water trucks that followed. It was vengeance, propaganda, and strategy fused into a single act. Stalin understood that victory must be seen to be believed, and he ensured it was seen by all. Yet his design carried darker currents. The territories liberated by Bagration were not destined for freedom in the Western sense. Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, and parts of the Bagration, Poland would fall once more under Moscow's control. Partisan fighters who dreamed of independence would find themselves hunted by the NKVD. Civilians who had survived Nazi occupation now faced conscription, requisition, and political repression. For Stalin, victory was not about liberation but about power. His empire was expanding, and Bagration was the instrument. The legacy of Stalin's grand design is thus double-edged. Militarily, it was a masterpiece. Politically, it reshaped Europe, ensuring Soviet dominance for decades. Morally, it was a triumph built on sacrifice and stained with vengeance. The people of the Soviet Union celebrated, but many also grieved. The soldiers who marched westward carried both pride and sorrow, for they had seen comrades fall by the thousands. Families back home embraced liberation but also faced the weight of loss. In the end, Stalin's design achieved what it intended. The destruction of Army Group Center shattered the Eastern Front, liberated vast territories, and propelled the Red Army to the gates of Germany. It secured the Soviet Union's place as a superpower, ensured its dominance in Eastern Europe, and proclaimed to the world that the nightmare of 1941 had been avenged. Operation Bagration was not just a battle, it was a statement written in fire, in blood, and in the silence of 57,000 defeated men marching through Moscow. It was Stalin's symphony, played by the Red Army across the forests, rivers, and cities of Belarus, and its echoes would carry all the way to Berlin. The smoke still hung heavy over Minsk when the Red Army pressed westward. The city was a ruin of rubble, its streets littered with the wreckage of war and the broken columns of German prisoners. But there was no time to pause, no time to savor the triumph. Stalin and the Stavka had given their orders: pursue the enemy without respite. Army Group Center was shattered, but fragments still staggered westward, seeking to regroup along new, defensive lines. The Red Army intended to give them no chance. The pursuit beyond Minsk would transform Operation Bagration from a victory into a cataclysm, turning retreat into rout and rout into annihilation. The Soviet soldiers who marched west carried with them the momentum of triumph. They had advanced hundreds of kilometers in just weeks, smashing divisions, seizing cities, and breaking through lines that had once seemed impenetrable. Now, fueled by the taste of victory, they pressed harder still. Tank engines roared day and night, dust clouds rose in endless columns, and the thunder of artillery echoed across the countryside. Infantry clung to tank hulls, riding forward with rifles at the ready. Engineers rushed to repair roads, build pontoon bridges, and drag supply lines across the wreckage-strewn landscape. The Red Army had become a machine of relentless motion. For the Germans, the pursuit was a nightmare. Army Group Center no longer existed as a coherent force. Its divisions had been consumed in the cauldrons of Vitebsk, Orsha, Bobruisk, and Minsk. What remained were fragments, battalions where regiments once stood, stragglers wandering without officers, rear echelon troops pressed into makeshift defenses. Hitler demanded that they hold fortress cities, that they resist to the last man. But the soldiers knew the truth. The front was gone. Their maps no longer matched reality. Their radios were silent. Orders came too late or not at all. Every day brought more chaos, more destruction, more despair. The roads west of Minsk told the story. Burned-out trucks, overturned wagons, and dead horses littered the paths. Columns of refugees mingled with retreating soldiers, clogging the routes with chaos. Wounded men staggered along, their bandages soaked through, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. Abandoned equipment, rifles, helmets, field kitchens lay scattered in the dust. The air reeked of smoke, sweat, and decay. Above it all circled Soviet aircraft, hunting relentlessly. The whine of engines struck fear into every German column. Sturmovik attack planes swooped low, their cannons and rockets turning convoys into infernos. Survivors crawled from wreckage, only to be cut down in strafing runs. At Molodechno, northwest of Minsk, the Germans attempted to hold. It was a vital rail junction, one of the few points where reinforcements could arrive from East Prussia. Rear guards dug trenches, set up machine guns, and strung wire across the approaches. For a moment, it seemed the Wehrmacht might stiffen, but the Soviets were merciless. Artillery batteries massed in their hundreds, unleashing a barrage that shook the ground like an earthquake. Entire neighborhoods collapsed in smoke and flame. Then the tanks came, rumbling into the city with infantry swarming at their sides. Street by street, the Soviets advanced, blasting through barricades and hurling grenades into basements. The Germans resisted with desperation, but by July 5, Molodechno had fallen. The door to Lithuania was open. Further north, the Soviets drove toward Vilnius, the historic capital of Lithuania. There, German commanders sought to make a stand. Hitler had declared it a fortress city, to be defended to the last man. Units from the 3rd Panzer Army and retreating fragments from Belarus poured in, bolstering the garrison. The city became a bastion of trenches, barricades, and machine gun nests. For the Soviets, its capture would be symbolic as well as strategic, a gateway into the Baltics, a blow to German prestige. The battle for Vilnius would soon echo the ferocity of Stalingrad in miniature. To the south, Rokossovsky's armies pressed toward Baranovichi, Grodno, and the approaches to the Neman River. German rear guards clung to towns and crossroads, launching ambushes and counterattacks. For hours, sometimes days, they delayed the Soviet advance. But every stand ended the same way: artillery rolling forward, tank brigades smashing through, infantry storming in waves. The Germans fought, they bled, they retreated, and then they were destroyed. For civilians in the path of the pursuit, the scenes were apocalyptic. Villages burned as retreating Germans torched homes in scorched earth fury. Families fled into forests, clutching children and bundles of possessions, praying to survive the chaos. When Soviet troops entered, they were greeted with tears and embraces. Women offered bread, milk, or water. Men shook hands or wept openly. Yet liberation was shadowed by grief. Homes were gone, families shattered, entire communities wiped away. For many, joy and mourning were inseparable. The speed of the Soviet advance astonished even their own commanders. Supply lines stretched dangerously thin. Fuel ran low, ammunition stockpiles dwindled, and rations arrived late. Yet the momentum was too great to stop. Soviet engineers improvised, constantly repairing captured German trucks, seizing enemy fuel depots, and dragging artillery through swamps with tractors. Entire bridges were rebuilt overnight, allowing tanks to roll forward by dawn. For the Red Army, logistics became as heroic as combat. The German High Command scrambled to respond. Reinforcements from Army Group North Ukraine and Army Group North were rushed to the sector. Waffen-SS divisions, including the famed Viking, were thrown into the fray, but they arrived piecemeal, too late to halt the tide. Soviet armored spearheads were already miles ahead, their dust clouds visible on the horizon. Counterattacks flared, fierce tank battles raged in fields of wheat, but each time the Soviets pressed on, replenishing losses with relentless reserves. By mid-July, the pursuit had carried the Red Army to the very borders of Lithuania and Poland. Vilnius and Grodno smoldered in ruins. German soldiers streamed westward in broken columns, constantly harried, constantly bleeding. Hitler's fortress orders had become death sentences, sacrificing entire garrisons in cities that could not be held. Army Group Center had not only been defeated, it had ceased to exist. The pursuit beyond Minsk was more than a chase. It was a transformation of the Eastern Front. For 3 years, German soldiers had advanced across these lands with confidence, boasting of blitzkrieg and destiny. Now they staggered in retreat, their columns shattered, their pride destroyed. The Soviets, once desperate defenders, had become avengers, juggernauts rolling westward with unstoppable force. The arc of war had bent, and the momentum could not be reversed. For the men who lived it, the pursuit was unforgettable. Soviet soldiers remembered the exhilaration of victory, the thrill of riding forward into territory long lost, the embrace of liberated civilians. German survivors remembered exhaustion, hunger, and the terror of aircraft engines overhead. Civilians remembered liberation, yes, but also the ruins of their homes, the graves of their families, the scars of occupation. By the time July ended, the Red Army had advanced hundreds of kilometers beyond Minsk. They stood at the Niemen River, at the gates of Vilnius, and Grodno, at the borders of Poland and Lithuania. The pursuit had become a rout, and the rout had become annihilation. Operation Bagration was no longer simply a Soviet victory, it was a Soviet revolution in war. The Wehrmacht was broken, its aura of invincibility destroyed. The road to East Prussia and Warsaw lay open, and beyond them, Berlin itself. The pursuit beyond Minsk had shown the world a new truth. The Red Army was unstoppable. The Red Army's columns had barely settled into their new positions west of Minsk before their attention fixed on Vilnius, the historic Lithuanian capital. For centuries, Vilnius had been a crossroads of culture, empire, and war. By July 1944, it was something more, a fortress city decreed by Hitler himself, a bastion that was to be defended to the last bullet, the last man. To Stalin and the Stavka, it was a prize, too symbolic and strategic to ignore. Whoever held Vilnius held the northern gateway into the Baltic states, the railway arteries to East Prussia, and the psychological claim over Lithuania's soul. And so began one of the fiercest urban battles of Operation Bagration, a week-long inferno that earned Vilnius the grim title, the Stalingrad of Lithuania. The Germans knew what was at stake. Army Group Center had been obliterated, its divisions gutted or scattered in the collapse of Minsk. What remained of the 3rd Panzer Army, under General Reinhardt, poured into Vilnius. Shattered units, Panzer Grenadiers, SS detachments, Luftwaffe ground personnel, and local collaborators were reorganized into a garrison of roughly 15,000 men. Trenches were dug on the outskirts, barricades erected from rubble and overturned vehicles, and machine guns posted in every likely killing zone. Churches, apartment blocks, and factories became fortresses. Bridges were mined, streets blocked, and cellars turned into bunkers. The German order was clear. Vilnius was to be a Festung, a fortress city, to be held at all costs. For the Soviets, Vilnius was the next step in their relentless advance. The Third Belarusian Front, commanded by General Ivan Chernyakhovsky, converged from the east with overwhelming strength, nearly 100,000 men, backed by tanks, artillery, and air support. To the south, Rokossovsky's First Belarusian Front pressed forward to cut off German escape routes. Together, their aim was not just to capture the city but to encircle it, crush its defenders, and tear open the Baltic flank. The battle began on the 7th of July 1944 with a storm of artillery. Soviet guns, massed in the hundreds, unleashed a bombardment that blanketed the city in fire. Whole blocks collapsed into rubble. Trenches were shredded, barricades blown apart, and neighborhoods set ablaze. The infamous Katyusha rocket launchers howled across the sky, their trails of fire streaking into Vilnius before erupting in thunderous detonations. Smoke rose in towering black columns, blotting out the sun and choking the air. Civilians cowered in cellars, walls trembling, dust falling in clouds as explosions shook the city above them. Then came the infantry and tanks. Soviet rifle divisions surged into the suburbs, advancing street by street, house by house. Tanks rumbled forward, their cannons blasting apart strongpoints, their machine guns sweeping windows and rooftops. Engineers followed, dismantling mines, clearing barricades, and blasting open walls to create new passageways. The battle was close, intimate, and merciless. Every street became a battlefield, every building a fortress. German defenders fought with fanatic determination. Machine guns rattled from upper floors, cutting down attackers in the open. Snipers picked off Soviet officers from church towers and attics. Panzerfaust teams emerged from alleys to ambush Soviet tanks, blasting them at close range before vanishing into cellars. At night, flares lit the sky, casting the ruins in eerie light as firefights raged among the rubble. Counterattacks struck suddenly, retaking blocks only to lose them again by dawn. For days, the battle ebbed and flowed, a tide of fire and blood. Inside the city, civilians endured a living hell. Families huddled in basements, listening to the crack of rifles, the thunder of artillery, and the crash of collapsing buildings. Fires raged unchecked, filling the air with smoke and the stench of burning timber. When the fighting lulled, some emerged to carry water, extinguish flames, or bury the dead. But the battle always returned, sweeping through their neighborhoods with relentless fury. Liberation was near, but it came wrapped in destruction. By July 9, the Soviets had encircled Vilnius. All major roads west were cut, trapping the garrison inside. Yet still the Germans held on, awaiting relief. Hitler had ordered SS reinforcements to break through, and elements of the SS Panzer, Division Viking and other units launched a desperate counterattack from the west. Columns of tanks and infantry surged toward the city, colliding with Soviet forces in open fields. For a time, the Germans punched through, linking up with some defenders inside the city. But Soviet artillery and reserves closed the breach, sealing the encirclement once more. The relief attempt had failed. Inside Vilnius, conditions grew desperate. Ammunition dwindled, food ran out, and water grew scarce. Streets became impassable with rubble. Fires consumed block after block. The wounded lay untended in basements, their cries echoing through the night. Yet the defenders clung to Hitler's orders, refusing to surrender, fighting block by block until there was nothing left to hold. On the night of July 13, small groups attempted breakouts, slipping through the ruins under cover of darkness. Many were cut down by Soviet patrols. Others drowned in rivers or collapsed in exhaustion in the forests. A few managed to escape westward, but the vast majority were trapped. The next day, Soviet troops stormed the final strongpoints, dragging survivors from cellars and bunkers. Vilnius had fallen. The cost was immense. Thousands of German soldiers lay dead in the ruins. Thousands more marched away as prisoners. Entire units were annihilated. The fortress city had collapsed in less than a week, despite its defenders' ferocity. For the Soviets, it was a hard-fought victory, purchased with heavy casualties, but strategically it was priceless. The fall of Vilnius opened the gates to Lithuania, severed German lines in the Baltic, and placed the Red Army on the threshold of East Prussia itself. For the people of Vilnius, liberation was bittersweet. They emerged from cellars to find their city in ruins, its historic heart shattered, its neighborhoods burned, its streets littered with corpses and wreckage. Families searched desperately for loved ones among the rubble, sometimes finding only bodies. Joy, at the end of occupation, mingled with grief for what had been lost. Yet in Moscow, Stalin trumpeted the victory as another milestone of Operation Bagration. Pravda declared the fall of Vilnius proof of the Red Army's unstoppable might. The city's capture was celebrated not just as a military triumph, but as a symbol of Soviet vengeance and power. The Stalingrad of Lithuania had ended in Soviet triumph, and the road westward now lay open. The Germans, meanwhile, absorbed another catastrophe. Fortress orders had once again condemned thousands of men to destruction. Army Group Center was gone, Army Group North was threatened, and East Prussia stood exposed. The psychological blow was devastating. The Wehrmacht, once the master of blitzkrieg, had become a beaten force, clinging desperately to shrinking fragments of territory. The battle for Vilnius revealed the new character of the Eastern Front. No longer was the Red Army merely defending or counterattacking. It was storming fortress cities, smashing armies, and driving relentlessly westward. Every day the Germans lost ground, soldiers and hope. Every day the Soviets advanced closer to the Reich. The ruins of Vilnius bore witness to this transformation. Its shattered towers and smoking streets stood as a monument to the fury of war, to the courage of defenders, to the resilience of civilians, and above all, to the unstoppable tide of the Red Army. The Stalingrad of Lithuania had fallen, and with it, another door to Germany had been torn open. Operation Bagration rolled on, its fury far from spent. If Vilnius had been the northern lock barring the Soviet advance, then Grodno was the southern hinge. Once Vilnius fell, the Red Army wheeled south and west, its gaze fixed upon this centuries-old city that guarded the approaches to East Prussia and Poland alike. Grodno's position on the Neman River made it a natural fortress, a crossroads of roads and rails that had seen countless armies pass in the great wars of Europe. In the summer of 1944, it would once again be a battlefield this time, the scene of yet another fortress city falling under the storm of Operation Bagration. Field Marshal Walter Model, newly appointed commander of what remained of Army Group Center, understood the peril. He had taken command in catastrophe's wake, inheriting a front that no longer truly existed. His instructions from Hitler were the same as always: no retreat, no surrender, hold every fortress to the last man. Yet Model, for all his obedience, recognized reality. Grodno could not be held indefinitely. The best that could be done was to delay, to bleed the Soviets, to buy time for East Prussia's defenses to be prepared. And so Grodno was fortified as best as possible with the remnants of shattered divisions, Luftwaffe personnel pressed into infantry roles, and scattered SS and auxiliary units. In total, perhaps 25,000 defenders held the city. They had little armor, scant artillery, and no air support. What they had was desperation, and Hitler's command echoing in their ears. Facing them were the forces of the 1st and 3rd Belarusian fronts, led by Rokossovsky and Chernyakhovsky. They were fresh from victories at Minsk and Vilnius, emboldened by success, and supplied with overwhelming numbers. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops, supported by artillery, tanks, and aircraft, were poised to sweep into Grodno and crack the hinge that still tied German defenses together. Stalin's orders were clear. The Red Army was to press forward without pause, seize Grodno, and open the road into Poland. The battle began on the 13th of July 1944, with the now familiar thunder of artillery. Soviet guns massed along the horizon opened fire in a bombardment that shook the ground for miles. Entire villages east of Grodno disappeared in clouds of smoke and fire. Trenches collapsed, communication lines were severed, and the German defenders huddled in their bunkers, ears ringing from the concussions. Then came the howling salvos of Katyusha rockets, their trails streaking across the sky before erupting in devastating barrages. The very air seemed aflame. Behind this curtain of fire, Soviet infantry surged forward. Waves of riflemen, supported by tanks, advanced across the fields and forests, leading to Grodno. Engineers followed, clearing mines, repairing roads, and bridging streams under fire. The defenders resisted fiercely. Machine guns rattled from concealed nests, mowing down attackers in the open. Mortars thumped from gardens and courtyards, their shells exploding amid the advancing ranks. Anti-tank guns cracked, slamming shells into Soviet armor with deadly effect. Snipers fired from church towers, their shots precise and lethal. For hours, the Soviets pressed forward, checked again and again by desperate German counterattacks. Small groups of infantry struck suddenly, supported by what remained of armored vehicles. Panzerfaust teams ambushed tanks in alleys and farmyards, blasting them apart before melting back into the ruins. The Soviets responded with overwhelming force artillery rolling forward to smash each new line. Il-2 Sturmovik aircraft sweeping overhead to strafe trenches and crossroads, and fresh waves of infantry surging into the breach. Slowly, inexorably, the Red Army pressed toward Grodno itself. By July 15, Soviet spearheads reached the outskirts of the city. Grodno had been turned into a fortress of rubble. Barricades of stone and timber blocked streets. Houses became bunkers. Basements turned into strong points. Bridges rigged for demolition. The battle became brutal, intimate, and merciless. Soviet infantry advanced block by block, tossing grenades into doorways, storming stairwells, clearing cellars with pistols and bayonets. Tanks blasted barricades apart, their cannons echoing down narrow streets. Engineers detonated mines and blasted open walls to carve new paths through the city. Every block was a battlefield, every house a fortress. Civilians endured a nightmare. Families huddled in basements, listening to the roar of battle above. Fires consumed entire neighborhoods, filling the air with smoke and the stench of burning timber. When fighting lulled, survivors emerged with buckets to extinguish flames or dig survivors from rubble, only to be driven back into shelter as the guns roared anew. For them, liberation and ruin came hand in hand. German defenders fought with grim determination. Counterattacks struck Soviet positions, sometimes retaking blocks, only to lose them again within hours. Snipers targeted officers, slowing the Soviet advance. Panzerfaust teams struck tanks at close range, their explosions shaking the ground. But each stand ended the same way, with artillery, tanks, and fresh Soviet infantry overwhelming the defenders. By July 17, Grodno was encircled. Soviet forces had cut off all major roads, trapping the garrison inside. Yet Hitler's orders still held sway. The defenders were commanded to resist to the last. Ammunition was rationed, food was gone, and water scarce, but still they fought. Relief was promised. Elements of German units from East Prussia and remnants of Army Group North attempted to break through. Columns of tanks and infantry clashed with Soviet spearheads outside the city, fields erupting in fire and smoke. But the efforts were too weak, too late. Soviet artillery and armor smashed each attempted relief column, sealing the garrison's fate. Inside Grodno, conditions deteriorated rapidly. The wounded filled cellars, their cries of pain echoing through the ruins. Fires consumed block after block, turning night into a hellish glow. Ammunition was nearly gone, food exhausted. Soldiers scavenged what they could, fighting hand to hand when their bullets were spent. On the night of July 18, small groups attempted breakout runs. Many were cut down by Soviet patrols. Others drowned in rivers or collapsed in exhaustion. Only a handful made it through. The rest were trapped. On July 19, Grodno fell. Soviet troops stormed the final strongpoints, dragging survivors from bunkers and ruins. Columns of German prisoners, gaunt and exhausted, were marched away under guard. The streets were littered with corpses, wrecked vehicles, and smoldering rubble. Soviet banners flew from towers and government buildings. The fall of Grodno was another milestone of Operation Bagration. With both Vilnius and Grodno liberated, the Soviet advance had torn open the gates to Poland and East Prussia. Army Group Center, once the pride of Hitler's Eastern Front, no longer existed as a fighting force. Its remnants were scattered, its prestige destroyed, its soldiers sacrificed in futile fortress stands. For the Soviets, Grodno was proof that fortress cities, no matter how strongly defended, could not withstand their juggernaut. The Red Army pressed forward, morale soaring, confidence unshakable. For the Germans, it was another disaster in a summer of catastrophes. And for the civilians, it was liberation, entwined with devastation, their homes in ashes, their families scattered, their city free but broken. Operation Bagration's storm pressed on. Ahead lay the Niemen River, East Prussia, and Warsaw. Each victory brought the Soviets closer to Berlin. Each battle left only ruins behind. Grodno had been a hinge, but now it was broken. The door to Germany lay wide open. The thunder of battle rolled westward, and with Grodno in Soviet hands, the next obstacle loomed, a natural barrier that for centuries had stood as a line of defense, the Niemen River. Wide, swift in parts, bordered by forests and marshes, it stretched across Lithuania and into East Prussia, guarding the approaches to the German homeland. For the Wehrmacht, it was the last hope of buying time, of halting, or at least slowing the Red Army juggernaut. For the Soviets, It was a gateway. If crossed with speed and force, the Niemen would open the road into East Prussia and Poland, making the presenting to greed collapse of Hitler's Eastern Front complete. By late July 1944, remnants of German divisions fleeing from Minsk, Vilnius, and Grodno had stumbled to the river's western bank. Exhausted soldiers dug hasty trenches, laid mines, and strung barbed wire along the banks. Bridges were blown or rigged with explosives. Artillery pieces, often the last functional guns of shattered batteries, were positioned to fire across every ford and ferry point. Scattered panzer units, what tanks had survived the retreat, were placed in reserve to strike any Soviet crossings. Yet the German force was a shadow, its units hollow, its morale broken. Army Group Center had ceased to exist, and what remained could not hope to hold against the storm now gathering on the eastern bank. The Soviet High Command recognized the moment's importance. Generals Rokossovsky and Chernyakhovsky coordinated their fronts with precision. Orders were issued: cross the Niemen at multiple points simultaneously, overwhelm the defenders, establish bridgeheads, and surge westward without pause. Artillery was massed, engineers prepared pontoon equipment, and entire rifle armies were assigned to the task. Stalin and the Stavka demanded speed. Every day lost might allow the Germans to regroup in East Prussia. At dawn on July 24, the bombardment began. Thousands of Soviet guns opened fire, their shells screaming across the water. The riverbanks erupted in smoke and flame. German trenches collapsed, bunkers splintered, and villages along the western shore vanished in explosions. Then came the howling salvos of Katyusha rockets, their fiery trails arcing overhead before slamming into German positions. The sky glowed orange, and the roar of the barrage was unending. Under this cover, Soviet infantry surged forward. Engineers carried pontoons and assault boats to the river's edge. Soldiers waded into the water, rifles held high, the current tugging at their legs. Others paddled across in rubber dinghies or lashed together rafts. Machine gun fire swept the river, cutting down men midstream, but replacements pressed forward. Engineers detonated mines and cleared obstacles, working under fire, knowing a single mistake could cost dozens of lives. German defenders resisted with fury. Machine guns rattled from farmhouses, their tracers slicing across the water. Mortars rained shells on the crossing points. Snipers picked off officers directing the assault. Panzerfaust teams lay in wait on the western bank, firing at Soviet tanks that dared to edge forward. Then came the counterattacks. German infantry, supported by what armor remained, surged toward the nascent bridgeheads. Mortars and artillery pounded the riverbanks. For hours the battle raged back and forth, a brutal struggle of mud, fire, and blood. Soviet units fought with grim determination. Small detachments secured toeholds on the western bank, clinging to ruined houses, orchards, and patches of forest. Engineers worked feverishly to assemble pontoon bridges under fire. Across these precarious structures, tanks rumbled one by one, their treads thundering on planks as shells splashed into the river around them. Once armor reached the western bank, the balance shifted. German counterattacks met T-34 seconds head-on and were crushed in fire and steel. By July 25, multiple Soviet bridgeheads were secure. Infantry poured across, followed by artillery and supply columns. German defenses cracked. Panzer units that counterattacked were blasted apart by massed Soviet guns or destroyed in swirling tank battles amid the forests and fields. Convoys of retreating Germans were caught on roads and annihilated by Soviet aircraft. The dreaded Il-2 Sturmovik swooping low, rockets and cannons tearing through trucks, wagons, and men alike. For the defenders, the Niemen crossings became a nightmare. Soldiers trying to flee westward found the bridges destroyed, the roads blocked, the Soviets already across. Some tried to swim the river under fire, clutching rifles above their heads. Many drowned, weighed down by equipment, their bodies drifting downstream. Others surrendered in despair, emerging from trenches with hands raised, gaunt and hollow-eyed. The civilians of the Niemen region endured yet another round of devastation. Villages along the river were blasted by artillery, set ablaze by airstrikes, or consumed in the fighting. Families huddled in cellars as shells exploded above, the roar of aircraft filling the sky. When the Soviets entered, survivors emerged, shaken but liberated. For them, it was the end of years of occupation, but also the loss of homes, fields, and loved ones. Liberation and ruin arrived together, inseparable. Strategically, the Niemen crossings were decisive. The Germans had counted on the river as a stabilizing line, a chance to regroup. Instead, it became another graveyard. Army Group Center, already annihilated, had no chance to rebuild. Army Group North, still clinging to positions in the Baltics, now faced the threat of encirclement from the south. The gateway to East Prussia was open. The success was also a testament to Soviet organization and logistics. Engineers built dozens of pontoon bridges under fire. Supply columns rumbled forward, keeping pace with advancing spearheads. Aircraft patrolled overhead, striking reinforcements before they could arrive. Coordination between artillery, infantry, armor, and engineers had reached a level that the Wehrmacht could no longer match. The Red Army of 1944 was a machine of war, efficient, relentless, unstoppable. By the end of July, the Niemen was firmly in Soviet hands. The Red Army stood on the threshold of East Prussia itself. Behind them lay the ruins of Belarus and Lithuania, liberated but devastated. Ahead lay new battles, Warsaw, Königsberg, and eventually Berlin. The Niemen crossings had proven that no natural barrier could stop the Red Army, that no German order to stand fast could alter the tide. For the Soviets, the Braden crossing was more than a military achievement. It was psychological proof that they could not be stopped, that even the rivers of Europe could not hold them back. For the Germans, it was another catastrophe, another line breached, another hope extinguished. And for the civilians, it was the endless paradox of war, freedom, and destruction arriving in the same storm. The Red Army pressed on, its banners moving westward. The storm of Operation Bagration had crossed the Niemen, and with it, the last illusions of German defense on the Eastern Front crumbled. By the final week of July 1944, the storm of Operation Bagration had swept across Belarus, smashed fortress cities like Minsk, Vilnius, and Grodno, and stormed across the Niemen River. What lay ahead was not just another advance, but the threshold of the German homeland itself. East Prussia, the ancestral heart of German militarism. For centuries, this region had been a cradle of the officer class, steeped in discipline, tradition, and the myths of invincibility. Now, for the first time since Napoleon's march, a foreign army was about to breach its borders. For the Wehrmacht, East Prussia was supposed to be a bastion, a defensive wall where the Soviets could finally be halted. Hitler and the High Command clung to the belief that its rivers, forests, and fortified towns could buy time, could restore order to a front collapsing under the Soviet tide. But the reality was far darker. The Red Army was not slowing, it was accelerating. And the German defenders, exhausted, scattered, and leaderless, could only hope to delay what was coming. The terrain favored defense. East Prussia was a patchwork of dense forests, marshes, and winding rivers like the Pregel. Towns had been fortified, with trenches, bunkers, and artillery placements, turning them into strong points. Bridges were mined, crossroads booby-trapped, and every village prepared as a fortress. Hitler had ordered East Prussia defended to the last man, for the local population. That command meant conscription of old men and teenagers into hastily raised Volkssturm units. Refugees poured westward, their carts and wagons clogging the roads, as rumors spread of the Red Army's vengeance. The Soviets advanced with relentless precision. Generals Rokossovsky, Chernyakhovsky, and Bagramyan coordinated multiple fronts, ensuring that no single thrust bore the weight alone. Tanks rumbled forward, infantry clinging to their hulls, while artillery rolled behind, pounding suspected strongpoints into rubble before the infantry even arrived. Engineers, the unsung heroes of Bagration, moved just as swiftly, laying corduroy roads through swamps, dragging pontoons across rivers, and repairing bridges under fire. The first clashes inside East Prussia were brutal. At the Pregel River, Soviet engineers launched crossings under a storm of German fire. Assault boats paddled through waist-deep water as machine gun tracers swept the surface. Mortar rounds splashed into the river, throwing up geysers of mud and blood. Soviet soldiers pressed on, clinging to banks, crawling through reeds, and storming bunkers with grenades. Casualties were staggering, but by sheer force of will, the Red Army secured bridgeheads. Once tanks thundered across hastily built pontoon bridges, the German line broke. The battles for towns like Goldap, Staloponin, and Gumbinen became miniature infernos. Streets turned into killing grounds, buildings into fortresses. Soviet infantry cleared them room by room, often with bayonets and pistols when ammunition ran low. German defenders, Wehrmacht regulars, SS detachments, and Volkssturm alike fought with desperation. Snipers perched in church towers, Panzerfaust teams lurked in cellars, and machine gunners turned schoolhouses into strongpoints. Yet the Red Army pressed forward. T-34 seconds blasted barricades apart, IS-2 heavy tanks smashed through walls, and infantry stormed in behind. At Gumbinen, one of the fiercest engagements of the East Prussian campaign erupted. German armor, Panzer IVs, and assault guns fought a desperate defense in the narrow streets. The town echoed with the crash of cannon fire, the roar of collapsing buildings, and the screams of the wounded. Fields around the town became tank graveyards, littered with burning hulks. For days the fighting raged, but in the end, Soviet numbers and coordination prevailed. Gumbinen fell, and with it, another door to the German heartland swung open. For civilians, the Soviet entry into East Prussia was a moment of terror. For years, German propaganda had painted the Red Army as barbaric hordes. Stories of atrocities committed in Belarus and Ukraine filtered westward, often exaggerated but rooted in truth. Families fled in panic, clogging roads with carts, horses, and whatever possessions they could carry. Many never escaped, overtaken by the Red Army, or bombed by Soviet aircraft as they streamed westward. Others remained in their villages, hiding in cellars, awaiting whatever fate the advancing soldiers would bring. For German soldiers, the realization was crushing. The war that had once promised triumph now delivered only retreat and despair. They had seen comrades annihilated at Minsk, Vilnius, and Grodno. They had fought and failed to hold the Neman. Now they stood on soil they had once thought inviolable, fighting a battle they knew they could not win. Morale cracked. Units disintegrated into small groups of stragglers. Orders from Hitler to hold to the last were ignored as soldiers surrendered or fled. The Red Army's advance into East Prussia was not just military but psychological. Soviet soldiers, many of whom had lost families to German occupation, felt vengeance in their veins. Each captured town was both a triumph and an act of retribution. Each destroyed German division was justice for the suffering inflicted since 1941. Propaganda units recorded victories, broadcasting them to the world as proof that the Reich's days were numbered. By the first week of August, Soviet spearheads had penetrated deep into East Prussia. Bridges had been seized, towns liberated or destroyed, and German defenders thrown into chaos. The road to the Vistula River, and with it Warsaw and central Poland, lay open. Refugees streamed westward, Wehrmacht units fell back in disarray, and the myth of East Prussia as an impregnable bastion dissolved in fire and blood. Strategically, the advance into East Prussia marked the completion of Bagration's central aim, the annihilation of Army Group Center, and the breach of Germany's eastern defenses. The Reich had lost its shield. Poland, East Prussia, and eventually Berlin itself now lay vulnerable. For history, the symbolism was immense. In 1941, German soldiers had crossed into Soviet territory with arrogance and brutality. In 1944, the Red Army crossed into Germany itself, bringing with it the momentum of victory, the scars of vengeance, and the certainty that the Reich's end was near. The storm of Operation Bagration had carried the Soviets across hundreds of miles, through forests, swamps, and rivers, through fortress cities and open plains. Now, with East Prussia breached, the Red Army stood at the gates of Hitler's homeland. The final act of the war in the East was approaching, and nothing, not rivers, not fortresses, not Hitler's orders, could stop it. The thunder of artillery finally faded in the last days of August 1944. The forests of Belarus, once alive with the roar of battle, sank into silence, broken only by the crackle of fires and the groans of the wounded left in the fields. Operation Bagration, which had begun on June 22 with the greatest artillery barrage the Eastern Front had ever seen, was over, but its echoes would resound across Europe for the rest of the war and far beyond. In just 2 months, the Red Army had delivered one of the most crushing defeats in military history. An entire German army group, the center had ceased to exist. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility on the Eastern Front had been shattered forever. The scale of destruction was so vast that even the participants struggled to comprehend it. German officers wrote in disbelief of divisions that no longer existed, of corps reduced to scattered stragglers, of entire armies swallowed by the Soviet onslaught. Villages that had once marked the front lines were now graveyards, their charred timbers jutting from the ground like the ribs of carcasses. German survivors stumbled westward, gaunt and hollow-eyed, muttering about battles lost not in weeks or months, but in days. In sheer numbers, the disaster was staggering. Army Group Center had fielded more than 800,000 men when the Soviet offensive began. By the end, over 400,000 were dead, wounded, or captured. 17 divisions were annihilated outright, ceasing to exist on paper as well as in the field. Another dozen were gutted to skeletons. The Fourth Army, once a proud fighting force, was annihilated in the Minsk pocket. The Ninth Army, shattered at Bobruisk, existed only in fragments. The Third Panzer Army, mauled at Vitebsk and Orsha, was a broken shadow. Hitler's most powerful Central Army group, the linchpin of his Eastern Front, had been destroyed in a single campaign. The losses in equipment mirrored the human catastrophe. Thousands of tanks, assault guns, and artillery pieces lay smoldering in the fields. Whole columns of trucks, wagons, and supply vehicles littered the roads westward. Abandoned German helmets, rifles, and boots lay scattered like leaves after a storm. The Wehrmacht, already drained by years of fighting, could not replace these losses. Factories bombed by Allied aircraft in the West could no longer churn out replacements fast enough. Fuel shortages crippled what remained of the panzer divisions. The Reich's armies, once terrifying in their speed and firepower, were bleeding to death. By comparison, the Soviets had suffered staggering casualties, more than 700,000 killed and wounded, with thousands of tanks and aircraft destroyed. But the difference was one of scale and resilience. The Soviet Union, with its vast manpower reserves and industry relocated beyond the Urals, could absorb such losses. For Germany, the destruction was terminal. The Reich's armies were not merely weakened, they were broken beyond repair. The psychological impact was equally devastating. In 1941, German soldiers had stormed across Belarus with unstoppable momentum, driving the Red Army before them, capturing millions of prisoners, and standing at the gates of Moscow. For 3 years, they had clung to the belief that, however desperate the situation, they were the masters of battle. Operation Bagration destroyed that illusion. German soldiers now retreated not in good order, but in panic. They whispered of annihilation, of entire divisions disappearing overnight. The sight of endless columns of prisoners marched eastward under Soviet guard, of broken men who had once been comrades, told them that the war was lost. For civilians in East Prussia, the shock was profound. Propaganda had long assured them that the homeland was secure. that the Wehrmacht held the line far to the east. Now, within weeks, the Red Army stood at their door. Refugees fled westward in terror, clogging the roads with carts and wagons. Mothers clutched their children. Farmers abandoned their fields. The ancient heartland of Prussian militarism was under threat, and the Reich itself seemed poised to collapse. For the Soviets, the triumph was overwhelming. The Red Army had not merely survived, it had become unstoppable. The same soldiers who, 3 years earlier, had retreated in chaos before German blitzkrieg now advanced with precision and confidence. The same commanders who had once been inexperienced and hesitant now executed vast operations with skill that rivaled or surpassed their German counterparts. Operation Bagration was 1100-time proof. The Red Army was the most formidable fighting force in Europe. The political dividends were immense. In Moscow, Stalin celebrated the destruction of Army Group Center as the greatest victory of the war. Soviet newspapers proclaimed the triumph with bold headlines. Parades filled the streets, crowds cheered as captured German soldiers, 57,000 of them, were marched through the capital in a spectacle of humiliation. Behind them came water trucks to wash the streets, symbolically cleansing Moscow of the invaders' filth. The propaganda value was incalculable. To Soviet citizens, it was proof that the sacrifices of 1941-43 had not been in vain. To the Allies, it was a reminder that the Soviet Union was carrying the heaviest burden of the war, and the timing could not have been more dramatic. As the Allies fought their way inland from Normandy, Stalin could point to Bagration as the counterpart in the east. While American and British troops struggled through the bocage, the Red Army had smashed through hundreds of miles, annihilating an entire German army group. Churchill and Roosevelt praised Stalin's triumph, though privately they felt unease. Each Soviet victory brought Eastern Europe further under Moscow's shadow. Already, the outlines of the post-war world were taking shape. For the people of Belarus, the aftermath was a mixture of liberation and ruin. Cities like Minsk, Vitebsk, and Mogilev lay in rubble. Villages had been burned by retreating Germans. Fields were cratered and scorched. Survivors emerged from forests and cellars to find their homes gone, their families missing, their future uncertain. Liberation from the Nazi occupation came at a staggering cost. In many places, the Red Army was welcomed with tears and embraces. In others, suspicion and fear lingered. For Soviet rule brought not only freedom, but also requisitions, conscription, and political repression. Liberation and devastation walked hand in hand. In Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, the picture was even more complex. Some civilians greeted the Soviets as liberators from German occupation. Others, remembering the forced annexations of 1940, dreaded the return of Moscow's control. Resistance groups braced for new struggles, knowing that independence would not return. The Baltic states, trapped between two empires, were once again pawns in a greater war. Militarily, the consequences of Bagration were beyond dispute. Germany could no longer launch large-scale offensives on the Eastern Front. Its armies were permanently on the defensive. The destruction of Army Group Center opened the road to Warsaw, the Vistula, and East Prussia. It created the conditions for the Warsaw Uprising in August, a desperate gamble by the Polish resistance to seize control of their capital before the Soviets arrived. That uprising would end in tragedy, crushed by German forces while the Red Army paused on the eastern bank of the Vistula. The political tensions born of that moment would haunt the Allies for decades. In the West, the effects were equally profound. German divisions that might have reinforced Normandy had been annihilated in Belarus. Hitler's ability to fight a two-front war collapsed. The Western Allies advanced across France not merely because of their own strength, but because the Soviet hammer blow had pinned down and destroyed the Reich's central reserves. In a sense, Bagration was as much a victory for Eisenhower and Montgomery as it was for Stalin and Zhukov. For Hitler, the catastrophe was unbearable. He raged in his headquarters, blaming his generals, accusing them of cowardice and treason. He refused to acknowledge that his own strategy, holding every inch of ground, refusing to retreat, sacrificing entire armies to delay the inevitable, had caused the disaster. Field Marshal Bush, commander of Army Group Center, was dismissed. Field Marshal Model, the so-called fireman of the Eastern Front, was brought in to pick up the pieces. But even he could not undo the annihilation. The Reich was bleeding to death, and Hitler's orders only made the wound deeper. The soldiers who lived through Bagration carried the scars forever. German survivors wrote of hunger, exhaustion, and the terror of encirclement. They remembered comrades left behind in burning villages, endless marches westward under artillery fire, and the shock of captivity. For Soviet soldiers, the memories were different but no less searing. They remembered storming trenches under fire, crossing rivers through smoke, fighting room to room in fortress cities. They remembered comrades who fell beside them, buried in hastily dug graves. For them, the victory was glorious, but bought with blood. In the long view of history, Operation Bagration was more than a battle. It was a turning point. It reshaped the map of Europe, ensured the Soviet Union's emergence as a superpower, and sealed the fate of the Third Reich. Without Bagration, the war in Europe might have dragged on for years. With it, Germany was mortally wounded. The forests and swamps of Belarus, once the site of German triumphs in 1941, had become their graveyard in 1944. The cities of Minsk, Vitebsk, and Grodno, once under the iron heel of Nazi occupation, now lay in ruins but free. The Niemen River, once a line of defense, had been crossed in fire and blood. The Baltic flank had been turned, isolating Army Group North. And the road to Berlin lay open. Operation Bagration ended not with a single climactic battle, but with silence. The silence of devastation, the silence of shattered armies and burning cities, the silence of survivors emerging from wreckage to rebuild their lives. Yet it was also the silence before the next storm. The Vistula crossings, the Warsaw tragedy, the battles of East Prussia, and the final descent into Berlin. For those who lived through it, the memory of Operation Bagration was unforgettable. For history, it remains one of the greatest offensives ever fought, a campaign that changed the course of the Second World War. In the summer of 1944, the Red Army erased Army Group Center from the map, liberated millions, and tore open the road to Germany. The Reich, which once dreamed of ruling Europe, now stood on the brink of collapse. Operation Bagration was the storm that broke its back, and from that storm there would be no recovery.